rising to her feet, but her hands were still around her daughter. "Cat," he said through a confused smirk, "Lord Tywine is coming. He is making for the west, to defend his own lands. If we close our gates and shelter behind the walls, we can watch him pass with safety. This is Tully land," Edmure declared. "If Tywine Lannister thinks to cross it unblooded, I mean to teach him a hard lesson. The same lesson you taught his son." Her brother could be stubborn as River Rock when his pride was touched, but neither of them was likely to forget how Sir Jaime had cut Edmure's host to bloody pieces the last time he had offered battle. "We have nothing to gain and everything to lose by meeting Lord Tywine in the field," Catelyn said tactfully. "I appreciate your concern, sister, but with all due respect, I am commander of the forces in the Riverlands," Edmure asserted. "Only until Uncle Benjen gets back," Arya declared. Catelyn smiled joyfully. Long had she missed the stubborn and defiant tongue of her fiery little daughter. "My daughter speaks the truth. Benjen named you commander because he intended to reinforce the north against the Ironborn. Now that the north is out of reach with the fall of Moat Cailin, he will return soon," Catelyn reminded her dear brother. "By the time Benjen arrives, it will be too late and the Lannisters will have passed us by. I will not allow Tywine Lannister to march through our lands untouched. I cannot be indecisive at such an opportunity to break our enemies," Edmure declared. "Those are 20,000 Northmen camped outside, and when all my strength is marshaled, I should have 8,000 foot and 3,000 horse to add to it. Far more than anything Tywine Lannister can muster. I am no tactician, dear brother. But I watched the battle at Storm's End unfold, and the last thing I want to hear about is superior numbers, especially against a man like Tywine Lannister," Catelyn declared. "But I also have a plan. You've forgotten Roose Bolton. Lord Tywine defeated him on the Green Fork but failed to pursue. When Lord Tywine went to Harrenhal, Bolton took the Ruby Ford and the Crossroads. He has 10,000 men. I've sent word to Hellman Tallheart to join him with the garrison Robb left at the Twins. Edmure, Robb left those men to hold the Twins and make certain Lord Walder keeps faith with us. He has," Edmure said stubbornly. The Freys fought bravely in the Whispering Wood and here during the camps. Sir Stevron, Sir Ryman, Black Walder and the rest are with Robb in the west. Martin has been of great service scouting, and Sir Pewin helped see you safe to Renly. Gods be good, how much more can we ask of them? And do not forget that you were the one who negotiated that I wed one of Walder Frey's daughters without my consent. When Benjen turned around at the Twins, he sent a raven to tell me that the girls for him and I have already been picked out, and old Walder insisted on sending them south with him. They are on their way here with him now. I am to wed Roslyn Frey and Benjen is to wed Tyta Frey. Roose Bolton wed another, I hear. And haven't you taken 2 of his grandsons to be fostered at Winterfell? Now they are under attack from the Ironborn alongside your own children. Walder Frey is a slippery and cold creature. You should have heard the way he talks about his children. I'd say if we had 20 of his grandsons as hostages, he'd still betray us if it suited him and let us slit all their throats. But it won't come to that," Edmure declared. "Once the castle falls, Lord Tywine will have no safe retreat. My own levies and the northern host will defend the fords of Red Fork against his crossing. If he attacks across the river, he'll end as Rhaegar did when he tried to cross the Trident. If he holds back, he'll be caught between Riverrun and Harrenhal, and when Robb returns from the west we can finish him for good and all." Her brother's voice was full of brusque confidence, but Catelyn found herself wishing that Robb had not taken her uncle Brynden west with him. The Blackfish was the veteran of 100 battles, Edmure was the veteran of 1, and that 1 lost. Tywine Lannister is walking into our trap, on our terms, with our superior numbers being distributed on the field to our design. Victory in warfare is built up of 100 small advantages, and we seem to have all of them," Petter declared, speaking in favor of Edmure's plan. "The plan's a good one," he concluded. "Lord Tytos says so, and Lord Jon O's as well. When did Blackwood and Bracken agree about anything that was not certain, I ask you? Be that as it may." She was suddenly weary. Perhaps she was wrong to oppose him. Perhaps it was a splendid plan and her misgivings only from an expectation that events would unfold the same as they had at Storm's End. Catelyn looked down to Arya, who had been standing there in her grasp the whole time, and Catelyn had been too busy playing politics. "I still think you should wait for Benjen before making any such moves," Catelyn declared, making her final stance on the matter known. Noted sister, but the war waits for none of us and so neither can I. With that, Edmure marched out to prepare his battle and Petter bowed his head and walked off, leaving Caitlin alone with her little Arya. Caitlin and Arya spent the whole day together. Caitlin could not afford to let her out of her sight even once. First, they went and visited her father. Lord Hoster Tully was much as she had left him, abed, haggard, flesh-pale and clammy. The room smelled of sickness, a cloying smell made up in equal parts of stale sweat and medicine. When she pulled back the drapes, her father gave a low moan, and his eyes fluttered open. He stared at her as if he could not comprehend who she was or what she wanted. He rambled for a time until Caitlin could bear no more and left him to be tended to by Maester Vimen. Caitlin then sat with Arya for hours in the Godswood joined by her direwolf Nymeria, who she found on her way to the twins. Arya told Caitlin everything and Caitlin was eager to hear every word of it. She told her about her sword, Needle, given to her by Jon Snow, and how Ned had hired a Braavosi dancing instructor to teach her to use it. There was a time when Caitlin would have insisted a guard break the little sword over his knee into two halves and forbid Arya from using it. But not anymore. Caitlin no longer wished to control and change Arya, to make her something she was not. If she hadn't been the wild and untamed girl she was, she might have been a Lannister prisoner like her sister. Arya told her of the stable boy she was forced to kill with her needle, about how she ate pigeons and saw Ned's execution. Oh, how Caitlin wished she could have spared her such a sight. Then she spoke of how she was taken by Petter's men, of how they went to the Vale, then the twins, then reunited with Benjen on the march south when he went north to reach Moat Cailin. They went in for dinner and ate together and Caitlin told her story of all she'd done and how she'd watched the Battle of Storm's End, hoping her close view of a great battle would impress her warrior daughter. When Arya grew tired, Caitlin scooped her up and carried her to bed and lay there stroking her daughter's hair, singing old lullabies while she slept. Nymeria was right where she belonged, curled up on the end of Arya's bed, sleeping close where she could protect her. When Caitlin got up from the bed, she walked over to the sill of the window and knelt, clasping her hands together and closing her eyes, praying silently. She prayed to the gods, all seven. She thanked them for bringing Arya to her. She prayed never to lose her again. She prayed Robb to be safe in the west while at war. She prayed for Bran and Rickon to remain safe with the Ironborn on their doorstep. She prayed for Sansa, poor dear Sansa all alone in the clutch of her enemies. She prayed for her father and her brother and her husband's soul. She prayed for Theon too, praying for him to live. She could not bear for Theon to die, not until she had seen him once more, not until she had embraced him, thanked him, apologized for every harsh thing she'd ever said. The man who was protecting her sons against his own people could not die until she'd kissed his cheeks and told him that Ned loved him as a son, even if Caitlin didn't, even if perhaps she should have. When Caitlin thought she was done she hesitated and then returned to the sill of the window. She returned to her position of prayer and silently asked the gods to grant their protection to one more. Protect Jon Snow. Jon Snow who convinced Ned Stark to spare the wolves. One wolf who saved Arya from Joffrey, one wolf who saved Bran and her from the cutthroat and the two wolves who killed Lannister men for Robb and his army in battle. Jon Snow who gave Arya her needle, the needle she used to protect herself from the stable boy. Jon Snow who kissed Bran on the brow and begged him please don't die. Jon Snow who had cut the hand from the man who pushed Bran from the tower, the man who had been riding for Robb in the Whispering Wood. Caitlin would not lie and tell the gods she would love him like a son and treat him like one of her own. But by all the gods she'd swear to be different. She would not be needlessly cruel and hateful for no crime other than being born. She needed him to live so he could see her be different, she owed him that much at least. It should have been you, she had said when Bran fell. If my son falls in battle, may the gods forbid it, and you still draw breath by some cruel twist of fate, I will kill you myself for failing to protect him, she had said at Moat Cailin. So needlessly cruel, all in a petty attempt to justify her hatred and her broken promises of years past. When the prayer was done, Caitlin left the room quietly and went to her own for the night. The tower her brother had set aside for her use was the very same that she and Lysa had shared as maids. It would feel good to sleep on a feather bed again, with a warm fire in the hearth. When she was rested the world would seem less bleak. But outside her chambers she found Uther Edswain waiting with two women clad in grey, their faces cowled save for their eyes. Caitlin knew at once why they were here. Ned. The sisters lowered their gaze. Arthur said, Sir Cleo's brought him from King's Landing, my lady. Take me to him, she commanded. They had laid him out on a trestle table and covered him with a banner, the white banner of House Stark with its grey direwolf sigil. I would look on him, Caitlin said. Only the bones remain, my lady. I would look on him, she repeated. One of the silent sisters turned down the banner. Bones, Caitlin thought. This is not Ned, this is not the man I loved, the father of my children. His hands were clasped together over his chest, skeletal fingers curled about the hilt of some long sword, but they were not Ned's hands, so strong and full of life. They had dressed the bones in Ned's surcoat, the fine white velvet with the direwolf badge over the heart, but nothing remained of the warm flesh that had pillowed her head so many nights, the arms that had held her. The head had been rejoined to the body with fine silver wire, but one skull looks much like another, and in those empty hollows she found no trace of her lord's dark grey eyes, eyes that could be soft as a fog or hard as stone. They gave his eyes to crows, she remembered. Caitlin turned away. That is not his sword. Ice was not returned to us, my lady, Arthur said. Only Lord Eddard's bones. I suppose I must thank the Queen for even that much. Thank the imp, my lady. It was his doing. One day I will thank them all. Ned would have to wait in Riverrun for a time, at least until they retook Moat Cailin and drove out the Ironborn, then they would take him to Winterfell and lay him to rest in the crypts beneath Winterfell. Caitlin stayed with Ned alone that night for a bit, mourning her loss, but eventually, she left her chambers and went down to Petter's chamber. After apologizing for her accusations, she asked him to accompany her. Caitlin led Petter down to the courtyard of Riverrun, and there, quietly and unheard by others, Caitlin began to discuss the Kingslayer and the possibility of making Caitlin's prayers of Sansa a reality. She could not help Robb, she could not help Bran or Rickon, but maybe she could get Sansa back, even if it meant treason. Edmure was taking the war into his own hands, now Caitlin must too. Chapter 26, Healing at the Crag. Chapter text. The crag was more of a ruin than a castle, reminding Robb a little bit of Moat Cailin when he first saw it, though it was hard to see its details in the night. It was lightly garrisoned and their lord, Goran Westerling, was captured by Robb's forces at the Whispering Wood. They struck in the dead of night, their main force with torches, raised shields and a battering ram towards the main gate, distracting the garrison while two groups moved in through the dark on each flank of the castle, scaling the walls, one led by Smalljan Umber and the other led by Blackwalder Free. As Smalljan and Blackwalder took the Westerling troops along the battlements from each side, the battering ram broke through the gates and Robb took the chance. Leading the vanguard through the doors with his sword raised shouting Winterfell, Robb thought battle awaited him, but then he felt a strong impact on the joint between his right shoulder and his chest, followed by a throbbing pain. The impact was so strong that Robb fell back off his saddle and clattered to the ground, dragged around the courtyard with the spurs of his sabatons getting caught in one of the stirrups. At some point, while he was dragged through the courtyard, he banged his head inside his helmet so hard that he blacked out. In the dark, Robb's mind began to stir from the dreamless nothing, his eyes remained closed, his body numb and his thoughts fuzzy, like the fleeting moment between asleep and awake. Robb tried to open his eyes, move his body, but it was all in vain, it was as though he had forgotten how to move. Am I dead? Robb wondered. Is this it? Is this how it ends for me? Fear and anxiety overcame Robb as he motionlessly panicked in his own mind. No, this cannot be it. He thought to himself. Wake up. Wake up, damn you. Robb had to live, his sisters needed him, his kingdoms, he could not leave yet. Wake up. Suddenly, Robb felt something cold touch his brow, stinging then freezing for a moment, and as the sensation persisted on his brow, he recognized the feeling to be wet. It was like a cold damp cloth was being pressed there. At that moment, Robb's eyes flickered open, only for a moment, letting not but a faint blur of light pass through his eyelashes. Robb then persisted, his eyes fluttering and his eyebrows rising as high as they could go until finally, his eyelids parted. When Robb's blurry vision finally settled, the fuzzy shapes in front of his eyes sharpened into the image of a girl. At that point, rather than feeling assured he was alive and awake, Robb was never more convinced that he was either dead or dreaming. Robb could tell from the stone roof behind her head that he was inside a castle, but the girl's face was illuminated in sunlight, perhaps from a nearby window. The girl had a heart-shaped face, curly chestnut hair that shone in the sunlight, a gentle smile and doe-like soft brown eyes. At first, Rob wondered if it was the goddess Alessa, consort to the Magna of the Gods and the Lady of Peace. Had she come personally to take him through the pale forest to the Hall of Afluda where Rob's father, Jory, Veon Poole, his aunt Lyanna, his uncle Brandon and his grandsires that he'd never met and all the fallen men and women of the North waited for him? No, Rob thought, the Queen of the Gods would not bear the face of a young maid. It was clear to Rob that the girl was roughly the same age as him. Maybe this beauty was Frania, the goddess of love, so youthful and fair. If it was indeed Frania, Rob would proudly challenge Skarn for his bride as so many had done before in the old legends, though none had bested the god of war in such matters. The girl's beautiful doe eyes were set upon Rob, she had a confused look on her face, peering down at Rob as though he were some mystery. She tilted her head and looked closer at him and then like a startled deer and backed away and hurried off. Rob wanted to beckon her back or to follow her, but the young wolf was too weak to even move and even trying to lift his head was so exhausting that he drifted back to the dark embrace of sleep. When Rob next woke, his whole body ached with pain, especially the throbbing between his shoulder and his chest. He could hear whispered mutterings around him and feel a soft wet tickling feeling on his fingers. When Rob's eyes opened, he was lying down, inside a stone building and surrounding his bed staring down at him, smiling as he opened his eyes were members of his battle guard. Jon was there, and so were Smalljon, Daisy, Eddard and Torren Karstark, Toreg and Dormund Giantsbane, Harold Hardying, Jon Redfort, Owen Norrie, and Oliver Free. "Hey, there he is," Smalljon said happily as Rob awoke. "Ha ha, welcome back to the land of the living," said Toreg. "Gave us a fright there," said Owen. "Knew you'd pull through," Daisy added. All of Rob's close friends and comrades were complimenting him on being alive. "What happened?" Rob managed to croak as he lay there, looking at the smiling faces around him. "You rushed headfirst through the gates of the crag screaming Winterfell and took an arrow through the shoulder," Jon recounted. It hurt to move his head, but Rob fought through the pain and managed to glance down to his shoulder, wrapped in bandages with dried blood on it. Rob also caught in the corner of his eye the source of the soft wet tickling feeling on his fingers, Grey Wind, licking his hand. "Then you fell off your horse and got dragged around the courtyard. We thought you were dead." Jon, the Blackfish and both the direwolves went crazy and killed as many men as they could reach before Sir Rolf Spicer finally sounded the surrender, Smalljon declared. Rob gulped and wetted his throat. How long?" he managed to ask. "The battle was last night, it's now midday," Jon explained. "The Westerling girl who was tending to your wounds came and found us. She said you opened your eyes and so we all came to check on you," Daisy declared. The image of the beauty who looked down on Rob flashed before his eyes again. "Westerling girl," he croaked, trying his best to hide his desperation to know more. "A girl called Jane. She's Lord Goran's daughter. Her uncle, Sir Rolf, is the Castellan who surrendered to our forces. Lady Sybil Westerling asked that the girl be allowed to tend to your wounds as a show of faith," Torren explained. "Jane," Rob pondered, recalling the details of the beauty as he looked up to the ceiling. Rob began to groan. "The battle, how many?" Rob uttered. "No more than 20 men on our side. Everyone was mostly concerned about you," said Toreg. Rob was able to turn over his hand and rub Grey Wind's nose, but that seemed to be the extent of his strength at the moment. "You got rattled around pretty bad in your armor when your horse was dragging you in circles. Master Vargono's physicians say you've broken a couple of ribs and you got bruised all over. That means you can't move for a while," Jon explained. "I need to make plans, prepare for next move," Rob declared as he struggled to try and force himself up through the pain. "Oh no you don't," Jon declared, pressing one of his fingers down and pushing Rob back onto the pillow. The pressure of Jon's little index finger felt so strong, Rob could not push against it in his weakened state. Rob let out a grunt of discomfort. "The Blackfish is commanding the army in your stead. You just need to rest and get better, the war's not going anywhere," Jon commanded. Rob barely managed to nod his head up and down with his head rested on the pillow, conceding to his brother's orders. With that, Jon ushered the few of the battle guard out and let Rob rest, with each of them wishing Rob well as they left. "Keep a close eye on him, boy," Jon said to Grey Wind before he closed the door. Rob huffed out a breath of air, closed his eyes and drifted back into the dark. Rob woke again. He could feel the sensation of hands on his bare chest. When Rob managed to arch his head down, a pair of slender hands were gently applying a balled-up cloth to the purple and yellow bruises on his chest. The cloth was cold and damp, as it had been before when Rob first awoke. Rob's eyes followed the hands up the arms past the shoulders and back to the face of the girl he'd mistaken for the goddesses of the Wirewood. The Westerling girl Daisy had called her, and Torrin had said her given name was Jane. When she dabbed the cloth on another of Rob's bruises upon his abdomen, the pressure caused pain, and Rob granted his displeasure, despite his best efforts to conceal his discomfort. The Westerling girl glanced to Rob upon hearing the grunt, only then realizing he was awake. Immediately she recoiled her hands from Rob's chest with haste. It reminded Rob of what he had once done as a child, when he yanked his hands back from a jar of sweet biscuits when he was caught by Gage the cook, hoisted up to the high shelves of the kitchen by sitting on John's shoulders, who was in turn sitting on Theon's shoulders. The girl blushed with embarrassment and stood from the seat next to Rob's bed. "My lord, your grace," said the girl as she curtsied nervously. The girl stood with her eyes on the ground and her hands clasped together. She looked scared of him. "Of course she's scared of you, idiot," Rob thought to himself. Rob had taken her father prisoner in battle months earlier, then charged through the gates of her home past a battering ram and took her family captive, her home, her household, and even she was his captive, at least in a manner of speaking. I was only tending to your wounds, your grace," she stated, trying to justify her action. "Of course," Rob croaked, motioning his hand for her to calm. "Please," he said, motioning to his chest and welcoming her to continue her treatment. She hesitated, but she returned to her seat and continued to apply the cold cloth to his bruises. Rob did his best to keep his grunts and his sharp hissing breaths silent, not only to feign an image of strength but also to calm this Westerling girl, for every time she saw Rob in pain she shuddered as though she feared Rob would call for her head if she did him any pain. Greywind was in the room, lying curled up on the stone floor nearby. As Rob lay there in silence watching awkwardly as the girl applied a cold cloth to his bare chest, he tried to break the uncomfortable silence. "My name is Rob, by the way," he said, finally introducing himself to the girl. The Westerling girl turned her head and looked at him for a moment, her soft doe eyes fixed upon him and her eyebrows slightly knitted in confusion. A smile then curled on her face and the gentlest giggle escaped her. "Yes, I know who you are," she said with a smile. Rob's eyes rolled into the back of his head. "Idiot," he thought to himself. Of course, she knew his name, how could she possibly not? Did he think she'd failed to notice the entire war, the siege last night, and never bothered to learn the name of the man she was treating? When Rob had failed to recognize his own uncle during the Battle of the Camps, he thought to himself that his stupidity was so great that he would make Hodder seem to be an archmaester of the Citadel by comparison, and now he felt all the more certain of it. "Pull yourself together, you bumbling fool," Rob thought to himself as he wondered if his brain had been mushed up inside his helmet when he fell from his horse. Rob tried to salvage his dignity by joining in Jane's amusement, though Rob's laughter, however light, caused great pain to his ribs. "I am Jane Westerling," she responded, still smiling. "I am indebted to you, my lady. Thank you for your hospitality." The words Rob spoke caused the smile on Lady Jane's face to melt away into a solemn frown. Rob quickly realized his error. Her hospitality. "You idiot," he thought to himself. The poor girl had no choice in the matter. Rob had stormed her castle and taken her family as captives. She had not given Rob any hospitality that he did not take by force with climbing spikes and a battering ram. Rob cleared his throat. "Forgive me. That was insensitive to your situation, my lady," Rob said softly. The Lady Jane gracefully shook her head and managed a soft smile. "Think nothing of it, your grace." Lady Jane continued her work, softly dabbing the cloth on Rob's wounds. "Your care is quite gracious, my lady. Such compassion towards an enemy has proven to be a rare thing from my experiences in this war thus far," Rob said. Lady Jane looked nervous once again, the corner of her lip twitching for a moment, and Rob began to fear he had scared the girl by calling himself her enemy. "My mother and uncle requested that I tend to you. They believe a gesture of kindness such as this would be the best recourse for our current situation." Rob nodded respectfully, understanding her wish to mitigate any animosity against her family while they were effectively under the blade of the Northern Kingdom. "A generous and welcome show of kindness, but I assure you unnecessary." Your family and your household will be treated with the utmost respect during our occupation of the castle. You have my word, Rob assured her, and Jane's shoulders seemed to lower as she took a long exhale, like a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. When Jane was done applying the cloth to Rob's wounds, she pulled the blanket back over his chest, covering him. "Can I get you anything, Your Grace?" Jane asked, standing up, awkwardly seeming unsure what to do now that she had finished treating Rob's bruises. Rob thought for a moment, not wanting the girl to leave and trying to fabricate an excuse to keep her around. Now that Rob thought about it, he was quite hungry. His men said that it was midday when they came to check on him, and who knows how much time passed when he awoke next. He only knew that enough meals had passed him by to make his stomach gurgle and growl. "Actually, I am quite hungry. If it were no trouble." "No, none at all," Jane said obligingly, and with that she curtsied and walked from the room. Shortly after Jane had left, Rob gathered all his strength and sat himself up on his bed. Every bruise on his body, the arrow wound in his shoulder and the cracks in his ribs, he'd been told about punishing him for taking such actions. Rob used his good arm to fix the pillow up vertically, cushioning his back against the wall, and lay there. Rob after all didn't want to be on his back, staring at the ceiling as he ate, choking on his food. Jane returned to the room a short while after, carrying a tray with a bowl and a spoon on it. She was surprised upon seeing Rob sitting up straight on the bed, but said nothing of it. "I was told to bring you this," Jane said as she presented the tray to Rob. Potato soup with a small bun of bread on the side. Rob tried to take the tray, but his arrow-struck arm betrayed him when he tried to lift it, causing him to grunt. "Here, allow me," said Jane as she moved the chair she had sat on closer to Rob's side and put the tray down on it. Jane then used the tips of her fingers to push back a wavy strand of chestnut hair back and tuck it behind her ear, and then slowly sat down on Rob's bed, seating herself next to Rob's thigh. She then took up the bowl and spoon and began to scoop up the soup. Jane then looked to Rob, her eyes seeming to ask for approval, and Rob gently nodded his head, and the young Westerling girl lifted the spoon and began to move it towards Rob, the bowl underneath following the spoon to catch any drips. Jane hesitated and stopped moving the bowl and spoon as it approached Rob. She looked at him, and a moment of awkwardness lingered between them, quickly followed by the two of them smiling, smirking and eventually chuckling aloud. The weirdness of Rob about to be fed like a baby by a girl his own age was too ridiculous for either of them not to laugh. After they settled, they tried again and Jane began to feed Rob. The awkwardness did not dissipate as the meal continued, but neither did their shared amusement in it. When Rob was almost finished with his soup, a knock at the door abruptly ended his meal. "Come," Rob said as Jane put the bowl and spoon down on the tray and stood up from the side of Rob's bed. John came in wearing a dark linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a black padded cloth jerkin like a gambeson without sleeves. Behind him came one of the physicians from Master Vargano's camp, the youngest of his field surgeons, a girl named Talisa. Rob had seen John and the girl become quite close since Vargano's company had joined them at Oxcross. At first, Rob noticed his brother's distracted glances when he saw her across the camp tending to the wounded. When Rob inquired about the girl, John told him her name but insisted he barely knew her. Something changed for them during their time at Ashmark. Rob began to notice them taking long walks together on the outskirts of the camp, talking and smiling, and John was seen less and less during the nights. Rob would never have imagined John to find companionship during their campaign of war. Rob of course had no problem with John and Talisa's blossoming relations, but it never seemed to be within John's prospects to pursue such a connection. Rob had his fun with the girls back in Winterfell, or at least kissing and fumbling in the dark corners of the castle or laying out on a blanket in the moors outside. Theon was the one who had actually experienced women, gloating about it often. Sometimes Theon, Jax, Poxy, Tim, Hwood, Wyl and the others from the castle made promises to take Rob and John down to Wintertown and make men out of them, but then the king came, Bran fell, his father went south, and more important things became Rob's priority. Rob would never have thought John would have been made a man of before him, but Rob would say nothing of it. The young surgeon Talisa was dressed in a white linen blouse with blue roses embroidered on her sleeves and a greyish-blue long sleeveless dress over it, along with a surgical box hanging off her shoulder by a leather strap. John Rob greeted happily. "Feeling any better?" John asked as he came close. "Well, I can string a full sentence together without my ribs hurting," Rob said. John smirked and then looked over to Jane, as though he'd just noticed her. This is Lady Jane Westerling. She's been helping me with my wounds. She's been very helpful, Rob said, awkwardly stumbling over his words. Oh, shut up, you idiot. Rob barked at himself in his own head. Jane blushed, or maybe she was just cringing through a forced smile of pity for Rob's stupidity. Yes, we met when she volunteered to treat you, John said, nodding to the Westerling girl. You remember Lady Talisa, right? John asked as he motioned to the young surgeon. Of course, Rob replied, recalling the few times he'd spoken with the surgeon from Volantis when he met up with John around the war camps with her in his presence. Good day to you, my lady, Rob greeted, looking to the young woman. Your Grace, she greeted. The dressings of your bandages need changing and I am to examine your wounds, Talisa stated, presenting her surgical box. I am grateful to you, my lady. If Master Vargano sent you, then I am sure you are a terrific physician, Rob praised. You honor me, your Grace, but actually it was originally Master Orlandry who was to treat you. John and I were walking together and he mentioned he planned to see you, so I volunteered to take over for the Master, Talisa explained. But do not let that discredit her abilities, brother. There are plenty of men within your army that can attest to her skills as a healer, John said, defending Talisa from her own modesty. Rob leaned forward and allowed Talisa to do her work, unwrapping the bandages around his arrow wound. John sat in Jane's chair after she took the tray of soup over to a table, nervously skirting past Grey Wind, who watched her pass by. She was clearly terrified of him. When Rob asked John to explain the current state of their forces, he glanced at Jane, but Rob nodded to him, assuring it was all right to speak of their tactics in front of her. Somehow Rob highly doubted that young Jane Westerling was Tywin Lannister's top spy. Everything between the crag and Ashmark is under our control, with the Pendrick Hills curtaining us along the northeast. The Blackfish has also taken the liberty of sending out scouts to occupy what's left of Castamere and Tarbeck Hall. The Lannisters held up in the rock can still marshal levies from the Fair Isle, along with everything from Feast Fires to Deep Den and as far south as Greenfield, but if they wish to challenge us they'll either march up the coast and our men will spot them from Castamere, or they'll march up the river road and we'll spot them from Tarbeck Hall. They won't be able to surprise us if they go for Ashmark or the crag. Rob nodded, approving of what had been done. What about north of us? Rob asked. The Lannisters don't have many houses to call on north of here. Banefort, Windol and a couple of holdfasts for some landed knights, but that's about it. We have scouts north of here in case they try anything, but we don't expect they'll have much left to use against us. Most of their fighting men are either with Tywin or broken with either the Kingslayer or Stafford's hosts, John explained. At that moment, Talisa had finished undoing the wrappings on Rob's arm, revealing the arrow wound. Talisa gently sighed in disappointment. You've torn your stitches, she declared as she examined the wound. Rob recalled the pain in his shoulder was at its worst when he was trying to sit himself up on the bed when Jane went to get the soup for him, and wondered if that was the cause. I'll have to redo them, Talisa said as she rummaged around in her box. As John talked about their army's size, supplies, armaments, all the goods, livestock and gold they'd scoured from the Westerlands and the general status of their campaign, Talisa was sewing his arrow wound closed with a tiny bale hook-shaped needle, making Rob feel like one of Sansa's embroidered canvases. Ow! Rob grunted as the hook pierced through an especially tender bit of skin. Talisa gave a tisk to the king in the north. Stop squirming, she uttered in a whispered voice, causing John and Jane to smirk. Rob did his best to contain his expression of pain after that. After his shoulder was stitched, the bandages redressed and his arm tied in a sling around Rob's neck, Talisa examined the bruises on Rob's body. The bruising seems to have been slightly mitigated, she declared as she examined the yellow and purple welts across his body. What treatments did you provide him, my lady? Talisa inquired, looking to Jane. After a moment of hesitation, she spoke up. I applied a cloth dampened with cold water to his bruising. Talisa seemed impressed by that. The application of cold temperatures reduces blood flow around the area, which in turn reduces the size and swelling. Very good, my lady, Talisa complimented. Jane smiled and shrugged. I have 2 brothers. I am no stranger to treating bruises, she explained. Talisa then traced her fingers over Rob's ribs, asking him to identify where it hurt to give her a better idea of where the cracks were and how bad they were. Rob identified the painful areas and Talisa frowned. Well, it's not too bad, but still. You have 2 broken ribs on your lower left from your fall and being dragged around the courtyard, as well as a crack through your right scapula from the arrow piercing it. You're lucky the arrow only hit muscle, a little down and to the left, and it could have hit your lung," she said. Rob didn't understand half of what she was saying, but was happy to know he wasn't dying. "How long will I be like this?" Rob asked. Talisa began to pack up her box of equipment. "Hard to say. With treatment and regular monitoring, if all goes right, I'd say between 4 and 8 weeks for the bones, at least 6 for the muscle. I'd say 10 weeks at the latest if you're a slow healer," Talisa estimated. 10 weeks. 2.5 months you mean, Rob said, disbelieving of what he was hearing. "Don't worry, with all the treatments and medicine we have to help you heal faster, if you're patient and all goes well, you'll be on your feet in maybe a week or 2, and you might be good enough to travel in a month and a half," Talisa suggested. Rob nodded, but the idea of being idle for even so much as a week was agonizing. He was in enemy territory with an army to think of. This was no time to be bedridden. Talisa packed up her kit, curtsied to the bedridden king and left, her eyes meeting with John's in the moments before she left. Jane left quickly after that, showing Rob the same formal courtesy as Talisa before leaving. When Rob glanced out the window he saw it was already dark and night was rolling in, but Rob was still full from the soup he had been fed and did not require supper. "Tomorrow I want to see my lords and knights. I will receive them one at a time and talk with them a while. I wish to show them I am alive and sound of mind," Rob declared. "We'll host war meetings in here from now on until I am well enough to move around the castle freely. I will require a table tall and wide enough to be fitted over my bed so that I can have my maps and documents laid out before me," Rob declared. The chamber he was in was fairly spacious, but the bed was a rather small double, not surpassing given how little the Westerling family's wealth had become in recent years. A table such as the one Rob described should not be too hard to find or move into his room. "Shouldn't you be more focused on resting?" John asked. "My body is in need of rest, and plenty it shall get while I am tethered to this bed. My mind belongs to my people and my kingdoms," Rob declared. John nodded in concession to his king and brother's desires. "I'll see it done, but for now, to bed with you," John commanded as he got up from the seat. John then helped Rob to lie down properly without pulling his stitches again, then John fluffed his brother's pillow and left his chamber. Despite being asleep for a night and half a day, Rob was already tired, with his blinking becoming more frequent, and with each blink, his eyelids became heavier and heavier until they closed and would not open again. When his eyes were closed and his mind began to drift, his thoughts went to the Wirewood Forest once again, and there, even if only a phantom of his imagination, Jane was waiting for him. Chapter 27, Iron Breaker. Chapter text. When Theon finally rode out from Winterfell, a host of 6,000 mounted men followed him out of the gates. They came to Winterfell from castles, holdfasts and towns, mostly from the east, as those to the west remained to defend their homes if the Ironborn approached them. The great Jon's uncles Mors and Hother had assembled a host themselves, built mostly of winter wolves, old men of the north who wished to die gloriously in battle. They also rallied spearwives to their side, warrior women of the north like Mage and Daisy Mormont. They marched west towards Deepwood Motte to help House Forrester, Woods, Branch and Bowl retake the Motte from the Ironborn. To the south Lord Marndaly rallied whoever he could to begin the siege of Moat Cailin from the north, but they would need the support of the rest of the north to take it. At the very least the Marndalis would be able to blockade the moat from the Ironborn along the stony shore. The Hornwoods sent all their men south to join the Marndalis at Moat Cailin with haste before any could be called upon to join the host at Winterfell. Lady Donella Hornwood was a Marndaly by birth, making it sensible for her Wishby to join her cousin Wyman's forces. It was also probable that Lady Donella's quick action was to avoid the chance of her men being sent to Deepwood Motte, where her husband's bastard was now a captive. Since Darren Hornwood was killed by the Kingslayer at the Whispering Wood and Lady Donella was long past childbearing years, Lyanne Snow was now a possible candidate to be Lord Harley's heir, something Lady Donella probably dreaded. The day Theon led his men from Winterfell, they observed a few small ceremonies before setting out. A speech written by Maester Lewin was recited by Bran. Leif the Shaman did a smaller and simpler variant of the ritual she'd done months earlier at Moat Cailin, and then Theon did a speech of his own atop his horse, bringing his men to cheer in glory. Theon rode hard through the moors of the north at the head of his army of 6,000 men. Following close behind the shield of the north mounted on their war horses was a strong cluster of young highborn warriors. Not nearly as large as Rob's battle guard, but a good collection of warriors nonetheless. Patrek Malister, Benfred Tallheart, Ramsay Snow, Cleisewin and Theon as their commander. Soon these young lordlings would carve their names into the history of the North with swords reddened with the blood of their country's enemies. They camped out along the south of the rills when nightfall came and dispatched scouts to survey the stony shore. When their scouts returned, they reported a few villages had been burned, most of the villagers died with weapons in their hands and a few Ironborn attackers were found among the dead. The northern villagers had fought back bravely against their attackers, but the Ironborn had slaughtered them all, even the little children. The scouts had spotted a few campfires of the raiding parties and Theon was in no mood to wait. Though they had been riding all day, Theon still had the energy to fight and was desperate to make corpses of their enemies. Theon stood up and drew his sword, letting it glisten in the light of the campfire for all his men to see. "We have ridden hard and many of you are tired, but I will be restless until I have seen some Ironborn die upon my blade. Of those of you with strength left to push on, who will join me?" asked Theon. Many jumped to their feet, more than Theon expected. Theon decided to pick 200 men to ride with him. Patrek Malister, Benfred Tallheart, Ramsay Snow and Cleisewin, all went with him, and one of the knights from Seaguard who accompanied Theon and Patrek to the north was left in charge of the rest of the host. They rode through the dark until they could see the first campfire in the distance, then they dismounted and hitched their horses to some trees before creeping through the woods. Through the dark of the trees and the bushes, they saw the Ironborn warriors, laughing and drinking around the fire. Loot from the villages they sacked visibly piled around their camp. "Circle them, when I give the signal," attack Theon whispered. "What signal?" Cleisewin asked. Theon smiled. "You'll know when you see it." Theon's men skirted around the trees in the dark, circling the Ironborn, and then Theon pulled an arrow from his quiver and drew it. He aimed for one drunken Ironborn dancing around the campfire to amuse his mates. With the gentlest movement of his fingers, the arrow was let loose and the dancing Ironborn was skewered through the throat. As the drunken Ironborn flinched and murmured fearfully in confusion, Theon's men rushed in, charging the Ironborn with brandished weapons. There were roughly 60 Ironborn, but they were made short work of with the speed and ruthlessness of Theon and his comrades. Of the warriors under Theon's control, none fought more viciously or aggressively than Ramsay Snow and his men. When Theon saw Ramsay slowly drag his blade across one of the Ironborn raiders' face slowly and with a smile on his face, it seemed a bit too cruel for Theon's liking, but Theon would not stand in defense of the Ironborn, not when he was trying to prove himself as a loyal warrior of the North. Besides, these men had slaughtered innocent villagers, women and children, and Theon had no sympathies for them, even if they died slowly and painfully. Theon cleaved 3 men down before the Ironborn were quickly annihilated by Theon's forces. The Northmen cheered and roared in glory at their first victory, and then after collecting the robbed goods and returned first to their horses and then their camp. The next day Theon and his force rode out again. They found another Ironborn camp and pillaged through it, then another and another. Over the course of the next few days, Theon and his men quickly went from battling Ironborn to hunting them. Ramsay's dogs led their charge and they'd split the host up into smaller groups to hunt down more raiding parties, still outnumbering their enemies however small the groups split up into. Some villages they arrived at just in time to save their people, and others were holding strong and fighting back formidably against the Ironborn. Every now and again, they found a village or a farm or a mill that had been razed by the Ironborn, the slaughtered women usually found raped. When their host stopped at the villages they protected for the nights, the women were often grateful and obliging to them and showed their gratitude in special ways. The Starks always said winter is coming, but Theon became certain of that fact given how many snows would be in the north in 9 months' time. They also found some of the Ironborn ships up and down the coast, tended to by skeleton crews while the rest were raiding. Theon ordered them all burned. Theon wasn't sure when or who started it, but eventually, the men started chanting Theon's name and calling him Ironbreaker. One afternoon, a scout came to Theon by the campfire as he sat with his comrades eating bowls of stew. "Lord Theon, we've spotted another Ironborn warband. This one is larger than the others, roughly 250 men," the scout declared. "Were they flying any banners?" Theon asked as he swallowed down the stew in his mouth. I mean, the flag of House Greyjoy was the only one flown," the scout said. Theon stopped eating and his heart began to thump within his chest, the moment he dreaded most. If it was the Greyjoy banner they flew, then most likely it was one of Theon's kin who headed the warband, perhaps Euron, whom Theon had heard nothing of and not seen when he was on Pike, perhaps Asher. Will I be made a kinslayer this day? Theon wondered to himself. Prepare the men, we ride within the hour, Theon declared, standing to his feet. The preparation for their next raid was the longest hour of his life. Fear and anxiety were twisting his stomach into a knot. Theon was not particularly superstitious, but the stain of kinslaying was a stain Theon did not wish to be marked with. Ready, Lord Greyjoy? One of the men asked as Theon tightened the strap of his saddle. Ironbreaker, Theon corrected. My lord, the soldier asked, confused. I am no longer a Greyjoy. You will call me Theon Ironbreaker, and nothing else, Theon declared. He was not sure if changing his name was enough to protect him from the blemish of kinslaying, but Theon had to hope it did something. Theon had lived more of his life in Winterfell than on Pike and was more loved there than he had ever been by his own kind. All that surely had to be enough to discredit any blood relation between Theon and his blood family, at least in the eyes of the gods who watched through the trees. Theon Ironbreaker, the Shield of the North, then mounted his horse and led his soldiers to face this great raiding party. When they drew near, Theon, Ramsay and Patrek dismounted their horses and took a closer look before engaging. Clee and Benfred were away with the rest of the host, further up the coast dealing with another raiding party. When Theon spied the Ironborn raiders, two faces stood out. One, an ugly fat wide-gutted old man with snow-white hair and a wide horizontal split down his mouth from an axe wound that took some of his teeth and left him 4 lips instead of 2, a man Theon recognized as Dagmar Clefture. Theon knew him from childhood. He was like Theon's precursor to Sir Roderick, the Master-at-Arms at Pike. Theon had hoped to see him when he arrived at Pike and remembered calling him uncle, on account of being a descendant from a Greyjoy bastard 4 or 5 generations back. Everything Theon learned from arms, riding, and sailing in his youth before he came to Winterfell came from Clefture. The other face Theon recognized was his uncle Aeron Greyjoy, the priest of the drowned god Vigar. He wore a cuirass of boiled leather and splint plates over his green and grey rough-spun wool robes and carried an axe and shield in his hand. Theon returned to the rest of his host and after a moment of hesitation, wondering if there were any possible way to avoid doing battle with 2 uncles, he relented his internal debate and led his men in the charge. When the Ironborn saw Theon and his men charging, they raised their shields and weapons and braced for their enemies' mounted attack. Theon rode through them, striking them down one after the other. When he spotted Clefture amongst the Ironborn, slashing down Theon's outriders, he relented for a moment, hoping that another man would kill him so Theon didn't have to, but when another of Theon's men were slain, Theon kicked his heels into his horse, driving it forward towards Clefture. He could not hide from his responsibilities. He was the Shield of the North, and if he had to choose between avoiding Clefture and stopping him from killing more Northmen, then it was no choice at all. Clefture saw Theon coming and blocked the strike of his sword and his axe. Traitor! Clefture shouted as he recognized Theon. Theon would have none of that. If he had been leading the Ironborn against the Northerners, then he'd be a traitor. Theon struck and swung his blade at Clefture, but he blocked it with his round shield. Eventually, Clefture swung his axe upwards and cleaved the throat of Theon's horse. The beast wailed, reared and fell on Dagmar, sending both of them tumbling to the ground. Dazed and sore, Theon slowly crawled to his feet, disoriented by his surroundings until finally Theon stumbled to his feet. Fat Dagmar was on his hands crawling out from beneath the horse. Theon saw Dagmar's axe on the ground and took the weapon up. Clefture looked to Theon, their eyes locking and his judgment clear, but then with one clean sweep Theon took Dagmar's head, cutting him at the jaw and reducing him to 2 lips, one across and one down. Theon's heart ached for a fleeting moment of regret, but then he shook himself free of it and returned to the battle. Theon took his sword up off the grace with his left hand and continued to carry Dagmar's axe in his right. Theon then fought the Ironborn with axe and sword, slaying his adversaries as they came. Quickly thereafter, the battle was won and the Ironborn were slain. When Theon saw the prisoners taken in the battle, his uncle Aeron was among those caught. The priest of the drowned god had a blooded gash upon his brow. Aeron's expression was not angry, upset, afraid or sorrowful, only stern and calm as it usually was. Uncle Theon greeted, taking a deep breath. Theon was not ashamed of the choices he'd made, but Aeron was his uncle nonetheless, no matter how distant Theon had become from him. Aaron glanced at Theon and then ignored him, seeming to show little interest in his nephew. "What are your orders, Ironbreaker?" asked Ramsay, holding his blade to Aaron's throat, a snarling ugly smile upon his face. "He's an unarmed prisoner and a priest of our faith, it would not be right to kill him in this state." "Put him in chains and have some men drag him back to Winterfell," Theon commanded. Perhaps with time, Aaron could have a part to play. Theon's uncle Victorian, who held Moat Cailin, was a witless brute of a man capable of only simple thought. Perhaps he could be persuaded to surrender the moat in exchange for his brother's freedom. Ramsay cringed in disgust for a fleeting moment but then smiled. "Of course," he said obligingly. Ramsay pulled Aaron to his feet. "Come now, High Priest Barnaclebeard. Let's go see my man, Reek." Reek was one of the bastard's boys, Ramsay's personal manservant, an ugly pasty-skinned man with blistered skin and tangled matted hair. His right name was Heck, but everyone called him Reek because of his foul odor. Ramsay's boys said that he took several baths a day but never stopped stinking, some kind of condition that a maester could better explain. When they rode and the wind was ahead of them, he rode from the rear; when the wind was behind them, he rode from the front, and if the wind came from the side, he always rode adjacent. He loved guarding the prisoners, clearly because he loved tormenting them with his stench. When they were bound and shackled and Reek volunteered for guard duty, he'd gag them with rags, claiming it was to keep them from plotting an escape, but it was obvious he loved forcing them to breathe through their noses, so they had to endure his reek. As Ramsay led Damfair away, Theon returned to Cleftjaw's headless body, the upper half of his head missing, and yet Theon could still feel the phantoms of his eyes glaring at him in judgment, calling him a traitor. When Theon saw one of his men glance at him standing over Dagmar, he panicked and dropped to one knee, then began pulling the rings from Dagmar's hand. He didn't want to be seen showing sympathy to his slain enemy, not when he was still trying to prove himself staunchly loyal to the North. Instead, Theon began crafting an image for all his men to see of him taking pride in his kill the only way Theon knew how, by claiming the Iron Price. Since Theon was a boy, Dagmar wore many rings, gold and silver and bronze, set with sapphire and garnet and dragon glass, all of which he won by the Iron Price. Now Theon's men would see Lord Ironbreaker, the Shield of the North, claim them as his own. He put them in a leather pouch tucked into his belt and would later string them onto a necklace for all to see. He would also keep the axe, a finely made single-sided bearded axe, a good addition to the sword and bow Theon carried. After that, Theon and some outriders pressed on to the coast and found the ships Dagmar and Aaron arrived on. Theon recognized the Foam Drinker to be Cleftjaw's vessel along with 3 others he did not recognize. When they were all burned, the tally of destroyed Ironborn ships they'd taken during their campaign numbered 12. 2 days later, when Theon's force reunited with Sewin and Tallheart, they confirmed the last 2 raiding parties and their longships were burnt. The army cheered the names of the young highborns who led them. Snow, Sewin, Malister, Tallheart, Ironbreaker. They went to one of the villages they had saved and drank and celebrated their swift end to the harrying of the stony steppes. Theon drank, cheered and enjoyed 3 young wenches who wished to show the Shield of the North their gratitude. Already they were telling tales of how Ironbreaker had killed Cleftjaw, with Theon praying to the gods that the change of his last name, the familial bond he had for the Starks over the Greyjoys, and the 5 generations that separated Dagmar and Theon's ancestry was enough to fend off the stench of Kinslayer. One of the Ironborn prisoners eventually yielded information about the invasion in exchange for being kept as far away from Reek as possible. The prisoner revealed that when King Balon realized Theon had escaped the Iron Islands and warned the North, he sent Damfair and Cleftjaw with 14 ships to raid the Stony Shore as opposed to the originally planned number of 8 longships, and that while Victorian took Moat Cailin, Asher took Deepwood Motte. With that, Theon declared that they would ride for the Motte on the morrow to help end the occupation, and then they would ride south and take the Moat, freeing the North finally. When Theon went to bed that night, with his 3 fair young wenches, he closed his eyes and prayed in silence that the Motte be taken by the Umber uncles before he arrived. Let Asher escape, let her surrender, or let her die before Theon arrived. Theon would keep his promise to himself and to her that he would kill her if they met again, which was why he prayed so hard to never see her again. But if he did, Theon Ironbreaker, the Shield of the North, would slay the Greyjoy princess without hesitation. Chapter 28, Treason. Chapter text. The journey had been a disheartening waste of time. When Benjen got the message from Seaguard, he hastily took 50 men and rode north, meeting Mace Raider's host on the road. He did not expect to see Lord Baelish there, and especially not Arya. He hugged her and held her close but could not stay long. After telling Mance of the impending attack on the north from the Ironborn, the two rode north with 20,000 men, sending the remaining 20,000 and all the giants down to Riverrun as planned. They arrived at the Twins with haste, but it had achieved nothing, for a raven from Greywater Watch had beaten them there. Victory and Greyjoy now held Moat Cailin, and their way north was cut off. With any attempt to take Moat Cailin from the south destined to end in defeat, Benjen made preparations to ride back south, but first had to endure the likes of Walder Free once again. Lord Walder bickered and grunted and insisted that when Benjen returned to Riverrun he take both his and Edmure's brides with him. Two of Walder's daughters had been chosen. For Benjen, Tyta Free, a fair dark-haired girl who was still an unwed maiden, despite being roughly Benjen's age. Her mother was a Blackwood, and she was familiar with the old gods of the forest, which Lord Walder thought should satisfy Benjen's northern nature. The other girl was for Edmure, a small, thin and delicate girl, pale skin and chestnut hair, pretty but delicate looking. Her mother was Lady Bethany Rosby, Lord Walder's sixth wife. As they returned to Riverrun, Benjen felt lamentation and dread at crossing the drawbridge into the castle once again. Arya would most likely greet him. The raven Benjen sent would doubtlessly mean that Arya probably already knew he had failed to reach Moat Cailin in time. She was so overjoyed to see him when he found her with the second host on their march south, they wept and held one another tight. He was the first of her family from Winterfell that she had seen since Ned's murder, and he had to then spoil their reunion by explaining that Bran and Rickon were in danger. She wanted to come with him, drawing her little needle that Jon had commissioned Mikken to craft for her, but Benjen smiled and told her to go on to Riverrun and wait for her mother and brothers to return. Now Benjen had to look his niece in the eye and explain his failure to protect her little brothers. During his ride south, Lady Tyta rode by Benjen's side, conversing with him and making an effort to better understand her betrothed. Despite Benjen's worrisome mind and his thoughts of his nephews, far away and under attack, he did not turn her away or refuse her conversation. She was to be his wife and he had a duty to attend her. She was kind and bright. She understood Benjen's priorities, and rather than asking him what his favorite color was or how many children he wanted from her, she asked him how he felt and if he wished to speak of the worries he carried. Benjen was grateful and amazed by how conscious the woman was of the ongoings of the war and Benjen's fears for Bran and Rickon. During their travel south through the Riverlands, Benjen's mood lifted as he continued to converse with Tyta for hours on end, learning more and more about one another, and the more Benjen got to understand his betrothed, the more he grew to like her. After the long march south, Riverrun was finally in view, the three northern camps on each of the three shores with the castle tucked into the corner of the fork. As Benjen rode through the camp on the north bank of the Tumblestone, he noticed that some of the northern warriors had a few cuts and bruises, a few were wounded and some were polishing war trophies of Lannister helms. An odd and unexpected sight. Benjen had heard nothing of any battles and the castle did not appear to have been attacked. Perhaps the men had skirmished with a Lannister scouting party, but Benjen did not know of any Lannister force north of the Tumblestone. Benjen pressed on, cheers and greetings from the northern army as the second half of the host finally joined them at Riverrun. A few men made comments about the second host missing the party, which Benjen could only think was a jape at them failing to reach Moat Cailin in time to fend off Victory and Greyjoy's assault. Mance veered off from Benjen to get the second half of the northern host spread out and settled amongst the three camps, while Benjen and some men continued on with the free girls to the castle. They took a small dinghy through the water gate and entered the castle, welcomed by guardsmen bearing fish-crest helms. Benjen helped Tyta out of the boat, offering a hand to her as she climbed off. Benjen and his company then ascended through the castle and came to the courtyard, where he first spotted little Arya bounding towards him at speed. Benjen reached out and scooped her up into the air and embraced her in a long hug. Their first reunion was cut so short because of the failed march north to Moat Cailin, but now he could truly relish in the joy of knowing she was safe and there with him. After the long embrace, Benjen finally set Arya down and introduced her to the free girls. They greeted one another curiously as was expected, but Arya was more focused on her uncle, giving him a cheeky look as she glanced back and forth between him and his betrothed. "How are you? Has your Uncle Edmure been good to you?" asked Benjen, resting both hands on her shoulders. "He has, but things have happened," Arya said nervously, the way she usually did when she confided in Benjen about something devious she had done. usually to Sansa. In this instance, Benjen believed her worry not to come from what she had done but rather what Benjen had done, or failed to do. "You've heard about Moat Cailin," Benjen said solemnly. Arya frowned and nodded. "There was nothing you could have done, uncle. You went as fast as you could," Arya said, comforting him. "Has there been any word from the north?" asked Benjen, his heart quickening with anxiety as he awaited his niece's response. "We received word from Maester Lewin. He says, Winterfell is safe but Deepwood Motte has fallen and the Ironborn are raiding the Stony Shore. Hotar and Mors Umber are rallying a host to retake the Motte. Lord Marndaly is summoning up men to siege Moat Cailin and Theon has ridden out to meet the Ironborn at the shore," Arya recounted. Benjen nodded his head, content to know that the North was at the very least still holding together without his help. Arya's eyebrows furrowed. "We also received a strange raven from Pike, as did lots of our bannermen. Apparently, Balon Greyjoy is telling everyone that he has already conquered the North and telling everyone to fear and respect him. He signed the letter, Balon Greyjoy, the 9th of his name, King of the Isles and the North." Benjen pondered what Arya had told him for a moment. It seemed rather brash, even for a man arrogant as Balon, to claim conquest and dominion over the entirety of the North with control over no more than a woodland hillfort and a swampy ruin. The best Benjen could surmise was for it to either be a scare tactic to trick Robb into marching his force back to Moat Cailin to be annihilated, or simply a testament to Balon's blind confidence that he would win. Or perhaps, Balon was so fatigued over hearing about Joffrey, Robb, Stannis and Renly that he was desperate to make his name and royal style heard throughout the Seven Kingdoms. "But none of that other things that I have to tell you about," Arya declared. Benjen's eyebrows knitted as he looked intently at his niece. "After your letter from the twins arrived, saying you were coming back south, Tywin Lannister's host from Harrenhal started riding west," Arya explained. "To reinforce the Westerlands," said Benjen, nodding his head. "When Robb first set out to raid the Westerlands, part of their strategy was the expectation that Tywin would eventually be drawn back to his own lands and caught between Robb's army and the Second Northern Host, robbing Tywin of the chance to escape. That's what everyone says his plan was, but Uncle Edmure led the army to fortify the Red Fork. He routed Tywin's army and sent them back east." Concern overtook Benjen. That was not the strategy that Benjen and Edmure agreed upon. Edmure's instructions were to hold in position and only ride out if Tywin engaged any of their castles or lands. "Were Tywin's men pillaging the towns and villages as they traveled west?" asked Benjen, crossing his arms. Arya shook her head. "That was not what I instructed of him," Benjen said, now getting a little angry. "My mother said as much," Arya replied. Benjen lit up with surprise. "Your mother is here?" He did not even think to ask if Lady Catelyn had returned from her parley with Renly. Arya's expression was not any happier and Benjen could tell she had more to say. "That's another thing. At that moment Arya was cut off by the joyous greetings of Edmure, who came striding through the courtyard, swagger prevalent in his strides. "Good to have you back with us, Benjen," Sir Edmure greeted. Benjen however was not in as joyous a mood as Edmure was. "Edmure," Benjen greeted, his expression cold. The acting Lord of Riverrun's eyes drifted over to the two women in blue cloaks behind Benjen, their betrothed. Benjen cleared his throat and stepped back. "Sir Edmure, this is my betrothed, Lady Tyta Free," Benjen introduced, taking her by the hand. Tyta curtsied and smiled, but her eyes were more focused on Benjen than Edmure. "And your own betrothed, Lady Roslyn Free," Benjen introduced. For the slightest moment, Edmure looked to Roslyn with the slightest recoil, as though he were expecting some kind of toad or more likely a weasel's face, but as Edmure studied the girl's face his eyebrows lifted in surprise and a smile curled on his face. Lady Roslyn curtsied, shyly looking towards the ground. "Sir Edmure, I hope I am not a disappointment to you," she said ever so shyly. Edmure strode forward and gently took the girl by the hand, looking deeply into her eyes. "You are a delight to me, my lady. And ever will be, I know." The girl smiled happily, her eyes fluttering. Benjen's growing attraction with Tyta had been cultivated through days on horseback talking with one another, and yet with one sentence and this Roslyn girl was already smitten with Edmure. "My lord is kind," she said softly. "And my lady is beautiful," Edmure said, pecking a kiss on Roslyn's hand, making the girl blush and titter. Arya rolled her eyes and looked to Lady Tyta, both equally dissatisfied by the instantaneous and shallow romance between Edmure and Roslyn. The fact that Arya was already getting along with Titer even with shared glances of low-hanging eyelids somehow made Benjen like Titer even more. Benjen cleared his throat, reclaiming Edmure's attention. The ladies have travelled long from the twins. Perhaps they might be taken to their chambers to rest while you and I discuss other matters, Sir Edmure, Benjen suggested, the sternness of his tone assuring the Tully Knight it was not an option. Edmure nodded, however reluctantly, and the two free girls were led off by some guards while Edmure and Benjen went to the acting Lord Solar with little Arya following along. I hear you won a victory in my absence, Benjen said, unbuckling the fastenings of his cloak and draping it over the back of a chair. Edmure was in the middle of pouring wine into a pair of goblets on the table. A great victory, Edmure corrected with a smile, handing one of the goblets to Benjen. Tywin Lannister tried to march for the Westerlands to go after Robb. So I deployed the entire force of the Riverlands and the northern host along every possible crossing and fortified them with caltrops and iron spikes. Tywin sent scouts to find an unguarded ford, but each scouting party was repelled with brute force. The sheer numbers of our combined strength and the terror of your northern giants and skin changers scared them off, Edmure said, recounting what had transpired. 3 days later, Tywin made a dozen attempts to cross the river, but they all turned from battles to organized retreats in minutes. Brax, Marbrand, Cricker Hall, Lefford, all tried and failed. The most heated fighting was at the stone mill, where I myself drove the Mountain and his forces scurrying back to his master. He was bristled with a dozen arrows when he retreated. Benjen was unimpressed. But is he dead? Benjen asked. The Mountain was Tywin's deadliest fighter, a rabid beast, better off dead than routed. No. Not that I am aware, Edmure said. What about Lord Tywin? Benjen asked. No, Edmure said, the confident smile melting off his face. Who is dead? Who is captured? Did you get Brax, Marbrand, Cricker Hall, Lefford, or any of the men Tywin led against you? Benjen asked. Edmure's confidence was now replaced with nervousness. They all routed so fast after the initial attacks, the fear of our numbers and the giants drove them back, Edmure explained. How many men did Tywin lose? Asked Benjen. Edmure gulped. 208. Benjen clenched his jaw. 208. Tywin's force was reported to be near 22,000. It would have been more if Tywin hadn't routed so quickly. Perhaps if we'd deployed the giants and the Northmen further back the battle could have lasted longer, Edmure suggested. Your instructions were to hold Riverrun and not to engage Tywin unless he attacked your lands, Benjen reminded the young brash red-haired Tully Knight. Thinking he can march freely through my kingdom with impunity is an attack on my lands, Edmure declared, defending his actions. If Tywin marched onto the Westerlands we could have trapped Tywin between our army and Robb's, but now Tywin is on his way back to Harrenhal with only 200 men less. Edmure smiled once again. But Harrenhal is no longer waiting for him. After you left the twins to march south, Roose Bolton received commands from me to take Helm and Tallheart, the Vale Knights stationed there, some free soldiers that could be spared, and Roose's host to claim Harrenhal for us. Amory Locke and the 200 men he had to garrison Harrenhal got one glance at the giants in the distance and rode to rejoin Tywin. Lord Tywin's host is now without refuge. Except for King's Landing, Benjen reminded Edmure. Then Tywin can deal with Stannis and Renly and leave us to deal with the Westerlands and the Ironborn, Edmure stated. Benjen folded his arms. Does that mean that Lady Catelyn was able to form an alliance with Robert's brothers? Benjen asked. Edmure went pale and his eyes widened. Benjen turned to Arya, who was fidgeting with her hands. Edmure took a long gulp of wine from his cup. Something has happened, Edmure said, his voice becoming stern. With that, Edmure led Benjen through the castle to a tower guarded by Tully soldiers. When Edmure approached the door, he said to the guards he wished to speak to the prisoner. The guards stepped aside, and inside, it was not a prison cell, but instead a furnished highborn chamber, and sitting on the end of the bed was none other than Lady Catelyn. What madness had Benjen stumbled into? Lady Catelyn, a prisoner. 1,000 questions circled in Benjen's head like snowflakes in a blizzard. Cat, said Benjen, feeling he needed confirmation to know it was truly her. Edmure stood stern and cold, not showing much warmth to his sister, and Arya looked sad, almost disappointed. A weak and sorrowful smile appeared on Lady Catelyn's face. "Hello, Benjen," she greeted softly. "Tell him Edmure commanded of his sister. Tell him what you did, Cat." Catelyn closed her eyes and exhaled in despair. She looked to the faces of her brother, good brother and daughter, and then spoke with her head held high and seriousness in her tone. "I, Catelyn of the houses Stark and Tully, of sound mind, committed treason against my liege brother, my liege son and the northern kingdoms," Catelyn announced to Benjen. Treason, Benjen thought. Catelyn was not capable of such a thing, to even suggest it was an impossibility in Benjen's mind. "What are you talking about?" asked Benjen. Edmure stepped forward and began to speak. "The night we returned from our victory at the fords, the Kingslayer and Sir Cleos Free escaped their cells. The guards were out cold, their cups of celebratory ale drugged, and there was a missing dinghy from the river gate." Benjen's face was struck with horror and disgust, and Catelyn turned away, unable to even look him in the eye. "But you recaptured him, yes? 2 nights in a boat, one missing a hand, you rowed them down and brought them back, right?" Benjen asked, frustrated and worried. "We sent our freeriders and scouts of course, and we found the boat and the 2 blonde men rowing it, but it was not the Kingslayer and the Sir Cleos," Edmure explained. Eyes fell once again upon Catelyn. Catelyn looked at Benjen with sorrow but not regret. "A lesser's mercy." "What have you done?" Benjen asked his good sister, his voice cracking with horror as he spoke. Lady Catelyn turned away, closed her eyes and sighed before speaking. "The men who were found in the boat were hired by me to steal the boat and sail it as far down the Red Fork as possible. I approached them clandestinely at one of the taverns across the Tumblestone. Each received a purse of gold dragons and were all too happy to accept without question. They didn't even ask questions when I insisted that one of them wrap their right hand in cloth when they rowed the boat down the fork." Benjen couldn't care any less about how Catelyn solicited 2 thieves into unwittingly playing as decoys. His true concern was the Kingslayer. "Where is the Kingslayer, Cat?" Benjen asked sternly. "On his way back to his father, I expect. Riding with a company of freeriders, disguised amongst their ranks." Benjen's head was beginning to spin with confusion. Cat had set the Kingslayer loose and sent him off back to his father. "When everyone was celebrating my brother's victory at the fords, I personally went to the guards and gave them a celebratory cup of wine, laced with a certain substance to make them sleep. After that, I quickly smuggled the Kingslayer and Sir Cleos into a hiding place within the castle and brought the 2 thieves I hired in to steal the boat." "How did you hide the Kingslayer in the castle, Cat?" "We searched every room before we even realized the boat was missing and the river gate was open," Edmure declared grumpily. Cat smirked with a disheartened smile. "I think it's safe to say I know this castle better than any of the guards. While you were scouring the castle for Sir Jaime and his cousin, I was trimming their hair and giving them a fresh pair of clothes I'd gotten from the freeriders I'd roped into my plot. It was hard to find hair dye to better the disguise, but I was able to find a Tiroshi peddler in a nearby town the day before Edmure returned with his host. Sir Jaime's hand was an especially hard part. I'm afraid you'll find that the statue of our ancestor Kermit in one of the hallways is missing a hand. I had to sew the edge of the glove into the shirt sleeve to keep it from falling off." Benjen could not believe Catelyn had done such things, colluded with their enemy, and for what? "Once they were cloaked and hooded and looked like common sellswords and the missing boat was discovered, I then slipped them out of Riverrun with everyone too concerned with riding down the boat to notice them, and they joined the freeriders I had hired and were given safe passage across the Red Fork on horseback without incident. Now they are beyond our territories and will be catching up to Lord Tywin's host." "Why, Cat? Why would you do this?" Benjen asked. Cat looked at him and took a deep breath in. "For Sansa," Catelyn said. Benjen grunted and turned away. She had petitioned Robb time and time again to trade the girls for the Kingslayer, but Robb had denied her, and now she had gone and freed the very man she wished to trade for some blind fool's hope he'd let Sansa go out of gratitude. When I returned from my trek to meet with King Renly, do you know what greeted me when I returned to the castle? Men in red cloaks hanging from the battlements, and my first thought was, if the Kingslayer is amongst them, then my daughters are dead. But the Kingslayer was not among them, and furthermore Arya was returned to you. She's right here. Is that not enough for you? Robb is alive, Bran and Rickon are safe behind the walls of Winterfell, and Arya is right here with us. Is that not good enough for you?" Benjen asked, motioning to Arya. No, it's not. I am elated to have Arya here and know that she is safe, but if I had Robb, Bran, Rickon and her all in my arms together, that would not be good enough for me. Sansa may be the only one of my children in the hands of our enemies, but that is more than enough to make a desperate woman of me. You rode back here with your betrothed, yes. Beget 3 children from her and then tell me you'd let one be left in danger and be satisfied to know the 2 others were safe, Lady Catelyn challenged, holding her head up high. Catelyn's justifications for being so desperate to get Sansa back were sound, but her chosen method of doing so was still a mess of irresponsible madness. When the Kingslayer's escape attempt was in action, he got his hands on a sword and tried to fight his way out. What if the next time the Lannisters tried to break him out of this castle, and believe me there would have been a next time, Jaime Lannister was killed? Arya may be safe and with us, but I cannot be expected to let her sister's only assurance of safety be left in such danger, Catelyn explained. No, you just handed over her only assurance of safety to our enemies. Do you think Tywin, Cersei or Joffrey will be so grateful that they'll just give us back Sansa out of the goodness of their hearts? Asked Ed Muir, raising a perfectly good point. No, it is in Jaime Lannister himself I have put my trust to see her returned to us, Catelyn declared. Now Benjen was getting worried and was truly beginning to wonder if Catelyn was legitimately mad. The Kingslayer, the most dishonest, notorious, oathbreaker alive, Benjen stated, assuring Cat knew exactly who she was talking about. You think I did this on a whim? You think me a flimsy-minded woman who acted in naivety and hysteria? I made my judgments on the Kingslayer before I put this all in motion. I went to him, talked with him, even got him drunk. I spoke truthfully to him and he spoke truthfully to me. That was our agreement. He admitted to being the father of Cersei's children, to pushing Bran from the tower, all of it. He also talked of the oaths he had broken and the wrongs he had done, and I listened and learned. Ed Muir shook his head in disgust. So after recounting how he broke his oaths as a Kingsguard to kill a king and fuck a queen, broke the laws of men by fucking his own sister, you can defend him and say he will honor his word to give Sansa back? Asked Ed Muir. When I understood what kind of a man he was. When he spoke of what happened with Aes, he did not arrogantly talk down as he would in other situations. He did not dismiss his honor or his oaths as petty constructs as I expected him to. Instead, he spoke of the Mad King's evils and how all the oaths of his life contradicted one another. He does care about his honor and his oaths, which was why he was so adamant I hear his justifications for betraying them. At that moment I knew what I needed to find. And what, pray tell, was that, sister? Ed Muir asked. His tether, his anchor, the one thing he still holds sacred. When he retorted to my accusations of him breaking every oath he ever took, he replied that every oath he took interfered with the other. How could he honor his oath as a Kingsguard to obey his king and stand by his oath as a knight to protect the innocent? He told me that all the things he stood by interfered with one another. What I needed was to find the one thing he did not betray, the one thing he has never forsaken when he has forsaken all others, the thing he chooses to believe in and stand by when he has nothing else. I knew from how he spoke that he couldn't live with himself if he didn't have at least one thing he held sacred, Catelyn asserted. Really? You found the one thing that would make the most dishonorable oathbreaker in the world promise to deliver your daughter into your hands despite it giving an advantage to his family's enemies. What was it? Benjen asked with his arms crossed. Cersei Lannister, Catelyn replied. Benjen exchanged looks with Ed Muir, not sure where Catelyn was going with what she was saying. He revealed it to me when he told me of why he pushed Bran from the tower, but I did not listen for it. He did it for her. He revealed it again near the end of our conversation when he was good and drunk. He grew angry when he reflected on how despicably he was treated for killing a man as wicked as the Mad King, and then turned it on me. He told me that he had never been with any woman other than Cersei and chided Ned for sowing his bast, for sowing Jon Snow. Cat explained, unusually speaking of Jon in a less than dismissive tone. It was the manner in which he said it. He spoke of his faithfulness to Cersei as making him more honorable than Ned. More than just fidelity, devotion to the woman he loves, that is what he prided himself on, that is what he took dignity in. That is what Sir Jaime holds sacred, not gods, nor his oaths, nor family nor the laws, but his love for her. That is how I knew I could trust him, because I made him swear it on his love for her. I know he took it seriously because he tried to weasel out of it, tried to change the wording to I swear on the Queen or I swear on my family, but I insisted he makes his oath on his love for Cersei by name, and he did it, though through gritted teeth, for he could not forsake a vow made in the name of the one thing he had not yet failed to uphold in his devotion. Upon hearing the entirety of Catelyn's explanation for her treason, the only thing Benjen could think of was how foolish Catelyn had been. Benjen understood that war often came down to gambles and acts of faith, but Catelyn's treason was the most reckless of gambits, one that could not be justified even if it resulted in Sansa's return to them. What Benjen was most uneasy about was the wretched stench of Littlefinger that hung on every word Catelyn had said. Benjen had only seen him the once when he was escorting Arya down to Riverrun. He spoke in riddles and had an uncomfortable smile, and Benjen did not trust the schemer. I take it Baelish is in the dungeons? Benjen asked, turning to Ed Muir. Benjen's words were met with confused looks on Ed Muir's face. Petter. Why would he be imprisoned? Catelyn asked. Benjen scoffed and rolled his eyes. Don't play dumb cat. I've known you for a decade and a half. You expect me to believe you drummed up this scheme and conspired with thieves and freeriders all on your own? That this plot with spiked wine and hair dye was all you're doing without any help from Littlefinger? Benjen asked. Catelyn's expression looked almost offended by Benjen's words. You think me so clueless that I could not pull this off without a man's help? I did consider asking Petter for help, but this was not his burden to bear, and I knew he'd either talk me out of it or be killed for treason if he went along with it. I acted alone in all of this. Ask any who I used. Ask the thieves who it was that approached them in the tavern. Ask the soldiers who they saw go down to the camp from the castle and visit the only company of freeriders that have not yet returned from searching for the Kingslayer. Find the peddler and ask who bought the brown hair dye from her cart. I spotted 2 serving girls as I left the maester's chamber when I swiped the sedative from his stores. They can confirm it was me. Petter had nothing to do with any of this. I will not see him held accountable for my crimes, Catelyn insisted. Benjen gritted his teeth. Cat was not fooling him the way she seemed to be fooling Ed Muir. There was no way Littlefinger was not part of this, but the two of them had crafted this treason very cunningly. Benjen had no evidence, nothing to use to justify Littlefinger's execution but a gut feeling in Benjen's stomach. Benjen had half a mind to slit Littlefinger's throat and dump him in the Red Fork, but that was not the kind of man Benjen was, and as much as he hated to admit it, without the Kingslayer, Littlefinger's network of spies that he had mentioned when they met on the road was now the best tool they had to get Sansa back if Lady Catelyn's scheme failed miserably, which Benjen expected it to. Benjen huffed and turned to Ed Muir. Sir Ed Muir, now that I have returned to Riverrun, I will be reassuming command of the forces in the Riverlands until our King Rob's return, but as before, Riverrun remains in your command, Benjen explained. Ed Muir opened his mouth and looked for the smallest fleeting second like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded his head in agreement. He liked the taste of control he'd been given, but he understood his place. Furthermore, as Lady Catelyn is a prisoner of the Northern Kingdoms in this time of war, I will also hold custody over Lady Catelyn, Benjen added, and Ed Muir reluctantly agreed. For your treason, you will remain here in this chamber that will act as your cell until judgment can be rendered by your son when he returns from the west. I will not send you to the dungeons in your father's own castle. You will be granted 2 hours outside this room a day under armed guard, 1 for prayer and 1 to visit with your father in his state. And as one last kindness, to Arya, not to you, she can visit you here. Arya avoided eye contact with her mother. She seemed sullen and sad at what had transpired. With that, Benjen left the room, storming out and unable to stomach dealing with Catelyn any longer. He wanted to yell, he was so angry, so frustrated with Catelyn's selfishness and stubbornness. Furthermore, Benjen was rightly and completely fatigued with Tully's. Chapter 29, When the Time Comes. Chapter text. Much had happened over the past few weeks. First, everyone in the royal court was almost ripped limb from limb by an angry mob of rioting folk in the streets of King's Landing. Then word had reached them of Renly marching north and Stannis departing Storm's End, both seeming to be on their way to King's Landing, and lastly, Tyrion had to wrestle custody of Tommen from Cersei. Sitting at his desk in his Solar in the Hands Tower, Tyrion was looking through Master Hallin's report of how much wildfire had already been synthesized, the progress report of the chain at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, and all other reports of fortifications for the city. He'd had visits and conferred with Varys, Bronn, Ironhound and Lord Rossby, discussing all necessary matters of the impending siege. Between Bronn and Ironhand, Tyrion was turning to rather underhand tactics to prepare the city for the siege. If they could hold the walls from the Baratheon brothers, then the siege could last for a long time, months even. If the most densely populated city was going to survive, already facing famine with the Rose Road cut off, then more drastic measures would have to be taken. Since the riots in the streets from the day they sent Myrcella off to Dorne, Ironhand and his gold cloaks had been sweeping through the city, removing the dissidents and looters that had been driving the chaos forward. The gold cloaks also swept through for thieves, thugs, rapers, muggers and any hired knife or sword who wasn't already employed to fight in the siege and remove them. Any who could not be proven of crimes were left untouched, and Bronn went after them with the sellswords to remove them discreetly. Rather than punishments fitting the crimes, all men were dealt out summary judgments and sentencing of the same kind, execution. Within 2 weeks, 2,000 men had been quietly removed and dealt with. 2,000 men dead, the number made Tyrion sick. He was not his father, he was not the kind of man that could order such actions and think nothing of it. The blood of those men was now on his hands, 2,000 men, and the number growing with each passing day. Even though they were rapers, murderers and rioters, it disgusted Tyrion to be the orchestrator of such an action. Tyrion's only solace was that when the city faced the coming siege, there would be 2,000 fewer mouths to feed and far fewer malcontents and brigands to bring chaos to the streets. Following Tyrion's actions, crime decreased rapidly and the number of people leaving King's Landing grew. It seemed Tyrion's cold and cruel actions had scared some of the criminal element away from King's Landing. His father would be proud. But in a city of 500,000, such a number was trivial to the siege effort while still remaining insurmountable to Tyrion's peace of mind. The two armies would not march together and would treat each other as enemies on the field, making it reasonable to assume that Renly would attack by land and Stannis would attack by sea, meaning King's Landing would have to fight a siege on two sides. Renly would undoubtedly attack the first point he could reach, meaning either the King's Gate or maybe the Lion's Gate if he had developed enough caution to distance himself from Stannis if he chose to take the River Gate, or the Mud Gate as the commoners called it. If Stannis wanted to split the city's forces and keep away from Renly and let his armies be thinned in the siege, his best bet would be the Iron Gate, but that was a strong and fortified gate and he knew that the Mud Gate was weak and just along the river where he could sail his men, but close to the King's Gate. Too close for Renly to not try and attack his brother's forces, though that didn't do him much good last time. There was also the matter of not knowing which brother would arrive first. Renly's siege engines would move slower up the road than Stannis's ships, but if Stannis was as smart as Tyrion thought him to be, he'd wait until Renly had begun the siege before attacking. It was the most logical move. Renly arrives, digs in and starts the siege. A few days later, both the city and Renly's forces are thinned, and then Stannis arrives when they are both weak and don't have the strength to hold out against his forces. After that, Stannis would take the city from whatever skeleton force held King's Landing at his arrival, and with that, he'd sack the city and drive back Renly's force. But Tyrion also had hope that Stannis might arrive while their forces still had strength. If Renly took the city before Stannis's arrival, his force would have a better chance of defending it from Stannis's army with their superior numbers. Whoever came first, Stannis or Renly, if they tried to take the city one at a time or both at the same time, either way, almost the entirety of the forces from the Stormlands, the Reach and the islands of the Crownlands were coming to destroy them. And what did Tyrion have? Tyrion had done everything he could to build up the city's army. The city watch under Ironhand had been tripled in size, now consisting of 5,700 gold cloaks, though only a rough 2,000 were dependable veterans. Ironhand had made sure that the more skilled of his men regularly drilled and trained up the greener of their comrades. Bronn had gathered together roughly 800 sellswords from within the city to bolster their ranks. Though it was the nature of a mercenary to fight so long as they were on the winning side of a battle and flee at the first sign of trouble, the ones Bronn picked out were locals of King's Landing, some with families that would be in danger if the city fell and would not give up so easily if the fighting grew challenging. In addition, 300 knights, either in the city or from around the Crown Lands, had heeded the call and joined the city's defense, though many were towny knights not yet tested in battle. Contingents from Rosby and Stokeworth also joined the city's defense, adding more men-at-arms to their ranks. Finally, roughly 150 of Tyrion's mountain clansmen allies remained to him and would fight when the siege came. To defend the city walls, hundreds of Scorpions, catapults and ballista were manned by hundreds of engineers. In the river and the bay, 45 royal war galleys stood ready to combat Stannis's fleet when it arrived, supplemented by at least a dozen vessels taken from traders. All in all, the city's forces numbered between 7,000 and 8,000 men. Tyrion's best hope, his only hope, was for Stannis and Renly to meet on the field, to let them fight amongst themselves beneath the walls and deplete their forces by throwing them against one another. But Tyrion was helpless to do anything other than hope. King's Landing had stood for just under 300 years, and to Tyrion's inconvenience it always stood in the same fucking place. The city was immobile, he could not maneuver it, he could not position it to avoid Stannis or Renly, he could not lure them to face one another, he could only sit there and wait for them to make their attacks and hope they were both brazen enough to fight amongst themselves when they arrived. A knock at the door drew Tyrion's attention. "Come," Tyrion called out as he shuffled the papers around on his desk. In came Tyrion's cousin Tyok, 13 years old, dressed in a red jerkin sewn with the Lannister badge in the right breast, long curly blonde hair and a bandage around his forehead, head covering the gash on his forehead he sustained during the riot. Tyrion commanded men to be sent out to find Tyok when he disappeared during the riot. He was the son of Tyrion's uncle Tivett, who was always kind to him. Tyok was found unconscious, bleeding from the head and surrounded by rioters when he was rescued from the crowds. After that, Tyrion took Tyok on as his second squire alongside his good lad Podrick, wanting to keep a close eye on Tyok, especially with the upcoming siege. "Lady Sansa Stark for your, my lord," Tyok announced as the small auburn-haired girl in a pale blue dress came walking shyly into the solar. Tyrion had asked Tyok to fetch the girl from her chambers to speak with Tyrion. Standing in the doorway behind the poor girl was Sir Meryn Trant, a cold and stern look on his ugly face. The poor girl could not go anywhere in the castle without some kind of armed guard, be it a pair of Cersei's brigands in Lannister armor or one of Joffrey's dishonorable thugs in white cloaks. "Thank you, cousin. Please, Lady Stark, come forward," he beckoned her, waving her towards him. "Some privacy, please," Tyrion asked of his cousin, though his eyes were on Sir Meryn. Tyok nodded, left the chamber and closed the door, leaving Lady Sansa in the room with Tyrion. Sansa walked slow and timidly, her eyes down and a sad look on her face. "You asked to see me, my lord?" she asked in a soft and fragile voice. "Yes. Please sit," he welcomed her, gesturing to one of the seats facing his desk. The girl's movements were soft and gentle as she sunk into the seat. It was like she was terrified that the slightest wrong movement and Tyrion would have her beaten. The effects of Joffrey's needless cruelty against the poor girl had made her paranoid and delicate. In Joffrey's presence, her fear was understandable. It probably served her well given how easily the rabid twit was set off, but the sweet girl had nothing to fear from Tyrion. "How are you feeling?" Tyrion asked, locking his fingers together. During the riot, Sir Mandon Moore abandoned her to protect Joffrey, and she would have been ripped apart by the rioters if the Hound hadn't found her. "Better, my lord," she said. Tyrion studied her face for a moment. The poor girl was only 3 and 10, yet had been forced to endure pain, loss and terror well beyond what someone of her years should have to. Tyrion wanted to comfort her, but he was her enemy, her captor, and nothing he could say could get her to trust him, a fact that Tyrion deeply regretted. "Are you and your friend Jane being treated well?" asked Tyrion, checking if any further cruelties had been dealt to the poor girl. "Of course," she said, as though her being mistreated was something unlikely and ridiculous. "If Joffrey or anyone else has or will hurt you, you can come to me and I will see that it is stopped," Tyrion tried to assure the girl. Sansa took in a deep breath. "You are mistaken, my lord. Joffrey is my love and my handsome king. He protects me and I am loyal to him," Sansa said, clearly reciting a rehearsed line, but her expression was cold and sad. The girl had learned to play her part and act like she was Joffrey's happy betrothed, a smart way to protect herself by playing the role. Tyrion cleared his throat and straightened himself up on his chair. "There are a few matters I wanted to discuss with you, my lady. The first of which comes with some serious tidings. I'm not really supposed to be sharing this with you, but I wanted you to hear it from me before it's spread around the castle," Tyrion said, picking up a scroll of paper off his desk. Sansa nodded her head cautiously and Tyrion handed her the scroll. "This letter and several more like them have been received all over the 7 kingdoms," Tyrion explained as Sansa began to unravel the little scroll of parchment and read from it. The scroll was an announcement from Balon Greyjoy, now styling himself as King of the Isles and the North and declaring himself independent from the Stark boy and the 3 Baratheon kings and claiming to have conquered the entirety of the North. It seems Balon Greyjoy has declared himself to be the 5th king thus far to enter into our quaint little war. At this rate we shall have more kings than kingdoms in our country, Tyrion said, trying to make light of the situation. My mother, my brothers, Sansa said softly. Tyrion sighed as he looked at the poor child with pity. She should never have been part of this war, just like so many others who were being dragged into the fray to fight to help someone who will never know their name wear a crown and sit an ugly chair. If the gods had any sense of justice, Joffrey, Stannis and Renly would fight one another in single combat for the crown while their armies and the people of King's Landing sat around drinking and placing wagers. Balon Greyjoy is an arrogant and blusterous man. He is reputable for biting off more than he can chew, hence the failed rebellion that led the Greyjoy boy to be fostered at Winterfell. The North is not an easy land to conquer and the Ironborn are not known for their great victories. I am sure that Greyjoy has sent these letters boasting his conquest of your lands prematurely, said Tyrion, trying to comfort the girl. But, you do not know, said Sansa with worry in her eyes. Tyrion sighed sadly. No, I do not. But I am sure your brothers are quite safe. If anything had happened to either of them, King Balon would have claimed it, Tyrion explained. As for your mother, Tyrion began, then glancing past Sansa's shoulder to the door behind her, half expecting it to open the second Tyrion said something incriminating. Tyrion returned his gaze to the girl and lowered his voice. Since you are a noble hostage from the House of the Crown's enemies, I am not supposed to tell you this, so I would very much appreciate if you didn't go around telling people what I'm about to say. It could be regarded as treason, which means if people find out I told you I could lose my head. I would rather not be without my head if I can help it. It may be ugly and a bit big on me and the eyes don't even match, but it is mine and I am very attached to it. With that remark, Tyrion was able to extract a gentle smirk and nod of agreement from the Stark girl. Tyrion took in a deep breath and began to speak. Your mother is not in the North. She traveled with your brother's host all the way down to Riverrun. She was then reported to have been at the Battle of Storm's End, serving as your brother's envoy to Renly. Last we heard she presumably returned to Riverrun where she remains, Tyrion explained. Sansa gently nodded and breathed deeply, seeming slightly relieved to hear her mother was alive and well. We also have reason to believe she might not be alone there, Tyrion began. Varys' little birds reported that our dear Littlefinger fled to the Vale in the company of a young girl matching the age of your sister Arya. Another report from our spies, which I warn you is uncorroborated thus far, claims that such a girl was seen traveling with Littlefinger and another second northern host down from the Twins to Riverrun in the company of a wolf. Sansa's chin began to quiver and her blinking became rapid as she managed a faint smile. Arya's alive, she said, with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It has been surmised. I do not know much of your sister, but your brother Jon described her as strong and free-spirited, and when I met your mother I understood her too as one who is strong and fierce in the time I was her prisoner. It is not a struggle for me to believe that your dear sister is a survivor. Sansa smiled, seeming grateful for Tyrion's words. As I said before, if I am revealed to have given you this information, it would be very bad for me. So please, for my sake, don't go around telling people, Tyrion warned, and the girl nodded her head. With that, Tyrion began to shuffle around the papers on his desk once again. There is another matter I wanted to discuss with you, Tyrion explained as he found the 2 pages of parchment he was looking for. As I am sure you are aware, we are facing siege from both the Baratheon brothers. Renly marches up the Rose Road and Stannis is sailing up the Narrow Sea. They will be upon us in the coming weeks, Tyrion explained grimly. Sansa pursed her lips and looked down to her lap. Needless to say, if either of them breach the walls and take the city, it shall be rather dire for myself and my family. Rather soon, you might see me alongside Joffrey and my sister decorating some pikes along the walls, or perhaps burned on pyres by Stannis' witch. And unfortunately, we cannot expect the carnage will not be limited to us alone. The girl tilted her head, confused by Tyrion's words. If one of Robert's brothers takes the city, they'll sack the Red Keep and pillage it, and the people inside it, Tyrion explained. He was trying to be delicate. It's not easy to tell a 13-year-old girl that 2 armies were approaching the city and would most likely try and rape her if they took the Red Keep. In the heat of battle, especially when sacking a city, men can become especially cruel, taking what they want without regard for the innocent. If the Red Keep is overrun, some men might become overzealous and try to have their way with the women in the castle, Tyrion explained. Nothing could truly express how gut-wrenching the look of despair and horror on young Sansa's face was to behold. But, as bleak as things may be for us if our enemies take the city, the same is not necessarily the case with you. You are here as a political prisoner to be used as leverage against the North. You can be used the same way by either of the Baratheon brothers, making you more valuable to them alive and unspoiled, Tyrion explained. Tyrion then handed the 2 parchment pages to Sansa. One was marked with a crowned black stag within a flaming red heart on a bright yellow field, and the other with a crowned golden stag on a green field. According to our scouts and spies, these are the personalized sigils being used by Stannis, he said, pointing to the one with the flaming heart. And Renly, he said, pointing to the one with the gold and green. If the Red Keep falls and you are found, then when the time comes, tell them who you are and demand to be taken to whichever of the brothers matches the sigil worn by their men, Tyrion explained. The girl examined the pictures carefully. Do you have any clothing with your family crests on it? Any identifying attire? Asked Tyrion. Some, Sansa said. Make sure you wear them if the city falls so that the soldiers can see your house crest and know who you are. When you are delivered to one of the Baratheon kings, thank them for saving you, and with any luck, in time they will formulate some kind of accord with your brother to see you safely returned to your family, Tyrion explained. Sansa nodded her head again. Also, when the siege begins, do your best to stay in your chambers if the fighting goes poorly for the city's defenses. I fear my sister would sooner see you dead than delivered to the Baratheon brothers. Hide if you can, barricade yourself in your chamber if you have to. You have no place getting hurt in our violence, Tyrion assured the girl. Thank you, Sansa said in all sincerity. Tyrion nodded his head obligingly to the girl. Have you memorized the sigils? Tyrion asked. I think so. And with that, Tyrion took the 2 pages of parchment back. That will be all, my lady, Tyrion said with a smile on his face. Sansa stood and curtsied and then turned to exit the solar, but then stopped in her tracks and looked back to the Lord Hand. My lord, what if the fighting doesn't go against you? What if Stannis and Renly are defeated? What is to become of me? She asked. Tyrion thought for a moment and frowned. Then I am afraid you are still our prisoner. But I assure you, if it is in my power, I will try to get you home, my lady, Tyrion explained in all sincerity. Sansa thought about Tyrion's words for a moment and nodded her head in gratitude. Remember those sigils and to wear your Stark garbs, when the time comes, Tyrion reasserted. As Sansa walked off closer to the door, Tyrion called out for Tyak, who opened it, and Sansa was escorted back to her chamber by him and Sir Meryn. And with that, now that he had done his best to assure the safety of one of the people in King's Landing, Tyrion returned his focus to keeping the other 500,000 safe. It was going to be a long night, and Tyrion hoped Pod or Tyak would be along soon, for the Lord Hand would need a great deal of wine. Chapter 30, Return to the Pride. Chapter text. When Jaime crossed the ford at the Red Fork, hidden within the ranks of the Free Riders he and his cousin rode with, nothing could state how terrified he was. His gut twisted and turned inside him, and his heart thumped as the Tully soldiers garrisoned at the ford stopped them. Then the captain of the Free Riders announced that they were on orders to search for the Kingslayer and Sir Cleos. In that second 1,000 what-ifs harassed Jaime's mind. What if the Free Riders get nervous and sell Jaime and Cleos out? What if the Tully soldiers somehow recognized Jaime through his disguise? What if the stitching Lady Stark had done to fix the glove carrying the broken-off statue hand to his sleeve came loose and the false hand fell off right in front of everyone? What if Lady Stark had a change of heart and a mob of mounted Tully soldiers came riding them down? Despite Jaime's infinite number of anxieties, the soldiers very quickly dismissed the Free Riders and they rode off, finally beyond the perimeter of Sir Bryndon's army. Jaime wasn't sure what feeling to expect when he finally crossed the ford and was beyond the last line of the Tully army. Would it be relief at being free, hopefulness at seeing his family again, or smugness at outsmarting an entire army of his enemies? Instead, the feeling that overcame Jaime as he crossed the ford was sheer joyful giddiness. He could not believe that he had finally crossed beyond the border and was now on the direct path back to his father. Jaime was not completely safe yet. He might cross a northern or riverland, a scouting party or a company could pursue him, which only made Jaime's determination to ride for his father's host stronger. The company rode fast and hard, the Freeriders just as desperate to join Tywin's host as Jaime and Cleos were. If captured, Jaime and Cleos would be back in their cells, but the Freeriders would face the gallows for betraying the Starks and Tullys. Jaime understood it was not whatever gold Lady Catelyn had given them that motivated the Freeriders to help them in their escape, nor any loyalty or alignment. It was Jaime's father that was their true motivation. Mercenaries were flimsy and fickle creatures who traditionally tucked tail and ran at the first sight of trouble, but war was not a business without risk, and it was the great rewards that made the risks worth taking. Smuggling two of Riverrun's most prominent hostages past an entire army was very risky, but gratitude for saving the firstborn son of the man reputed for shitting gold was a great reward. The gold Lady Catelyn had given them was merely collateral, something to ensure they did not walk away empty-handed if the plan went sideways. If they had been discovered, the Freeriders would take Lady Stark's gold, ridden off and left Jaime and Cleos for dead. After a few days of riding hard through the Riverlands, the company came hot on the tail of Lord Tywin's host. They discovered the areas where they had made camp on their retreat eastward. When the Lannister host was close by, perhaps less than a day's ride, they stopped by a stream where Jaime washed out the brown dye in his hair and cut the stitching of the leather glove from the cuff of his shirt sleeve, revealing his stump that would help identify him. Lastly, the captain of the Freeriders, a man called Sharky, along with his right hand, called Paws, approached Jaime and Cleos. Sharky was an ugly dark-haired cutthroat with a hooked nose and a salt and pepper beard of stubble. Paws on the other hand was a big and brutish red-haired man with a scar on his face and a thick beard. Both men reached into the saddlebags of their horses and pulled out bundled sheets of red cloth. "Here you go, compliments of Lady Catelyn," said Sharky, the two men handing over the bundles to Sir Jaime and his cousin. Jaime unbundled the red cloth he was handed, not a cloth in reality but rather a long cloak, a Lannister cloak. Sewn into the right breast of the cloak was a badge marked with a quartered shield with the first and third quarters marked with the blue twin towers on the field of grey and the other 2 quarters marked with the rampant gold lion on the field of red. "That's mine," Cleos said, looking at the cloak. Cleos took the cloak from Jaime and examined it. "This was in the trunk of my tent at Riverrun before we set out for the Whispering Wood," Cleos explained. Jaime then took the bundled-up red cloak in Cleos's arms and unraveled it to see the Lannister badge and golden silk filigree embroidered on the border, a cloak that Jaime had left in his own tent. It seemed Lady Catelyn had pilfered their cloaks from the loot of the Battle of the Camps and given them to the Freeriders. Jaime was surprised at how astute and practical the Lady Stark had proven to be in her plot, and Sir Jaime could not help but wonder if there was another guiding her hand and helping her scheme along, some unknown figure better versed in deception and manipulation. Sir Jaime and Sir Cleos traded the ragged hooded cloaks they wore and the half-helms that had been provided to them for the proper cloaks that they covered themselves in over their Freerider attire of mail and leathers. With that, they mounted their horses and pressed on, riding hard for the Lannister host, finally seeing the smoke from their camp as the sky began to redden with the descent of the sun behind them in the west. Eventually, Lannister sentries stopped them on the hill just beyond the camp, a contingent of a dozen pike-bearing horsemen led by a knight with a raised sword in a white and red feathered helm bearing a shield marked with 2 bronze halberds crossed between 4 red diamonds, on a white field, the coat of arms of House Yarwick. "Halt there! Who approaches?" the knight shouted out. One of the Freeriders had fashioned a white flag by tying a strip of white tent canvas to the end of his pike to ensure they were not attacked on sight. Jaime rode forward and raised the stump of his right arm up for all to see. Word of Jaime's crippling had been made common jest throughout the armies of Robb Stark, or so the guards that prisoned Jaime had teased. Surely word had reached his own people of his maiming. "I am Sir Jaime Lannister, son of Lord Tywin, Knight of the Kingsguard to the true king, Joffrey of the House Baratheon," Jaime announced for all to hear. The Yarwick knight did not lower his sword, nor did his men relax the grips on their pikes, clearly not believing Jaime. "Sir Jaime is a captive of Robb Stark. Your ploy is of no avail here, cripple. I do not know if you are a spy or a swindler, but either way, you and your company of armed vagabonds best take your leave or face our steel," the Yarwick knight declared. "I escaped Riverrun with the help of these men. You do not believe me? Find any man who knows me and my words will be proven. Is Leo Lefford with the host? Is Adam Marbrand? Robert or Flamant Brax perhaps? Fetch my uncle. Surely Kevan Lannister is with you. Or better yet, bring me to my father and let him look upon me and you will know who I am. The Yawik knight scoffed and laughed, as did his men. You think me a fool? Doubtless, this is a sad ruse. I would not trouble one of our lords with this farcical ridiculousness so you brigands can try and assassinate them. Begone or I'll have your head, the knight shouted. Then fetch Gregor Clegane. Surely the mountain would reward you for giving him men to kill which he does so love. What threat would this cripple be to such a man? But when he sees me and recognizes me, he will vouch for me. The Yawik knight seemed to have had enough and looked like he was about to give the command to attack. The freeriders tightened the grips on their reins, though seeming ready to flee and cut their losses rather than fight. Sir. He seems persistent that he will be proven true. Perhaps if we check him for weapons and show him to a man who knows Sir Jaime, this matter can be put to rest, one of the knight's riders suggested. The Yawik knight looked to his rider, scowling at the insolence of him daring to speak, but then stopped and thought on what had been said. His cloak is finely made, sir. Well beyond the craftsmanship of any forger that common mercenaries can afford, one of the other riders pointed out. The Yawik knight remained in a state of consideration, so Jaime spoke up and put forth an ultimatum to finally force his hand. Take me in alive, or take my head in on a spike. Either way, I will be proven true as the man I claim to be, but in the case of the latter, you shall take my place on a pike when your murder of me is revealed, Jaime declared, adamant that after all he'd done, all the risks he'd taken, his return to his family would not be ended on the account on some obstinate knight of a lesser house under his father's banners. The Yawik knight huffed and shook his head. Dismount yourself, then. You will be stripped of any weapons we find and taken to a man who knows Sir Jaime. Your friends wait out here. When your attempted swindle is revealed, I'll kill you myself for wasting my time. Now come along, let's put an end to this game and be done with it. Jaime quickly hopped down from his horse, walked over to the outriders, raised his arms and let one of the men dismount and pat him down. Then Jaime was walked over the hill, walking between three horsemen that trotted around him while the Yawik knight and the rest of his men remained to watch Cleos and the freeriders. As Jaime came over the hill, the Lannister camp was illuminated in the light of the descending sun behind him, and the banners of the Westerlands fluttered clearly on the spires of the tents. Swyft, Serret, Leiden, their tents all spread out across the field, Turnberry, Stackspear, Myatt, Foot, their tents and banners becoming visible as Jaime began to walk through the rows, the camp where men sat around fires, sharpened their weapons or sparred amongst themselves. As Jaime came deeper into the camp, Marbrand, Lefford, Cricker Hall, Banefort, Brax and finally Lannister banners came into view. Jaime began to stride forward, but the bottom end of a pike struck him against the chest from the horseman who rode beside him. "Oh! Don't try anything funny, Kingslayer. You stay right where I can see you," he commanded, using Sir Jaime's title of notoriety facetiously rather than judgingly, showing he too did not believe Jaime's claims. Jaime gritted his teeth and continued to walk, once again a captive but now treated as a prisoner by his father's own men. "There's one of the riders said, pointing across from them to a group of men outside a red tent. One of them was a big tall strong knight with a tough bulbous face, brown neck-length curly hair, a short trimmed beard and a scar above his brow. He wore full steel plate armor and a brown tabard over it marked with the brindled black and white boar. Sir Lyle Cricker Hall, the strong boar, second son to Lord Roland. Jaime knew him well, a man of honor, a fierce warrior on the battlefield and a gallant gentleman in court, especially with the ladies. Not the smartest of men, but good-natured and one of the strongest men Jaime knew behind the Clegane brothers. "Sir Lyle. A moment of your time?" one of the riders asked. Lyle turned his attention to the riders and then began to peer curiously at Jaime. "We would not usually bother you with this, but we would ask that you settle a matter for us. This man claims to be Sir Jaime." Lyle boomed with astonishment and joy in his voice. The strong boar marched towards Jaime, paying no heed to the riders and pulled Jaime into an embrace, laughing as he did. While Jaime did regard the Cricker Hall knight as a good friend, he was not aware that he and Lyle were on such close terms to warrant hugging, but to see a friendly face after so long, Jaime gladly accepted the embrace, patting Lyle on the back and joining with his laughter. "By the mother's mercy! You have returned to us," Lyle joyously announced as he looked Jaime up and down with his hands resting on his shoulders. By the mother's mercy indeed, Jaime agreed. But not the goddess, but rather the mercy of Sansa Stark's mother. Fetch Sir Kevan. Lyle shouted to a squire. Fetch Lord Tywine too, he shouted to another. Fetch everyone, he concluded as he laughed with joy. Sir Jaime then glanced up at the 3 riders who had escorted him into the camp. They all seemed shocked and disbelieving at the confirmation of Jaime's identity, none more so than the horror-struck face of the one who had struck Jaime across the chest with the butt of his pike. "And you men? Return to your knight and his sentries. Bring my cousin Cleos here and bring the Freeriders who escorted us into the camp and set up amongst our ranks. Assure them that they shall be paid for their services in time. A Lannister always pays his debts." "Yes sir," one of the riders replied, gulping after he spoke, and then the riders returned to the outskirts of the camp. The lords and knights of his father's bannermen came to greet him, shaking his good hand, embracing him and patting him on the back. Sir Adam Marbrand, Lord Leo Lefford, Sir Harris Swyft, all men who knew Jaime. Both Brack's brothers were there too, Flamant and Robert. They shook Jaime's good hand and welcomed him back. Jaime wished to speak to them of their father Andros and brother Tytos. Tell them of how gallantly Tytos fought in the Whispering Wood, though Jaime lost sight of him early on and found out later after the battle that he had been slain by the bastard who took Jaime's hand. Jaime wished to speak of Andros too, their father who died defending the rest of Jaime's host at Riverrun after he was imprisoned by the Stark boy. But Jaime would not say such things there while people were laughing and cheering. He would find them later at a quieter time and speak of their lost brother and father. Eventually, Jaime's uncle Kevan pushed through the crowd, his expression joyous as he took Jaime's face into his hands and examined him before pulling his nephew into a strong embrace. "Thank the gods, you're all right," he said as he pulled away and looked at his nephew. Eventually, the cheers and laughter died down and the crowd grew silent. A gap in the crowd that had formed around Jaime opened up, and walking through the narrow path of soldiers, knights and lords was Jaime's father. Lord Tywine was fully dressed in his fine suit of heavy dark crimson steel plate, the outrageous great cloak he wore when mounted on his horse discarded while inside his own camp. The Lord of Casterly Rock did not rush to his firstborn son with tears in his eyes and open arms. He walked at a relaxed slow pace, looking to Jaime as he approached. When his father was inside the circle of men, the mighty Lord Tywine stopped a few paces away from Jaime and looked him up and down. Tywine then nodded his head as he took a deep breath in and continued his approach, his steps even slower now. When Tywine stood right before Jaime, he looked down to the hands of his son, or rather his hand. Jaime's father then presented his left hand, open and welcoming. Jaime took it, the father and son gripping one another by their forearms, and without any particular haste, Tywine reached his free arm around his son, pulling Jaime into an embrace as he rested his head on his father's shoulder. The two Lannisters held the embrace while their men applauded the reunion. Not particularly as affectionate as Jaime would have liked, but it was exactly what Jaime would have expected from his father. Tywine was not a loveless man, but neither was he skilled at expressing his love. His father's tenderness was not easy to perceive, seeming non-existent to those who didn't know him and sometimes to those who did. He rarely ever smiled, and when he did, they were faint and more respectful than tender. Occasionally these faint smiles could be seen at a name-a-day or a wedding, but the happiest Jaime had ever seen his father with his faint smiles was when Cersei married Robert and at the births of Robert's children. At times Jaime wondered if the smiles were of love or for his ambitions to put his blood on the throne. Truth be told, Jaime was most certain of his father's love in his shows of coldness. When his mother died sowing Tyrion, his father turned away. He became stern and bitter and spoke rarely to anyone, even his own children, taking to spending great lengths of time in his own privacy. For a time Jaime resented him for it, for not being there for Jaime and Cersei when they suffered the pain of losing their mother. Jaime thought his father didn't care. Tywine did not look sorrowful, he did not weep, or even say anything at her funeral. He attended as was expected, then returned to his long solitude. It was not until the deaths of his uncles, Tyget and Geryon, that Jaime saw things in a new light. Tywine never got on well with either Tyget and Geryon. He argued with them often for different reasons, and just as when Jaime's mother died, his father shut everyone out and turned to solitude when each of his brothers died. That was when Jaime knew his father had love in his heart, for when his brothers, whom he spent most of his time quarreling with, Past he reacted to their deaths not with tears but nor with indifference, instead with cold brooding in his own privacy, contemplating his loss, and that was how Tywin Lannister showed love. The embrace between Jaime and Tywin lasted not but a few seconds before he pulled away. "You have returned to us," Tywin acknowledged as he sized his son up. "Most of me, but not all, I'm afraid," Jaime explained, presenting his stump. Jaime's father clenched his jaw as he looked at his son's missing hand. "I heard as much. How did you escape?" Tywin asked. Jaime looked at the faces of the knights and lords around them. "In private perhaps," Father Jaime suggested, not sure how to explain his story in the middle of a crowd. "Yes, of course," said Tywin, nodding his head. As Jaime, Tywin and Kevan turned to go to Tywin's pavilion at the heart of the camp, murmurs from the crowd arose as Cleos was escorted into the camp. "Is that Cleos?" Kevan asked, looking at his sister's son as he entered the camp atop his horse, escorted by the 3 outriders. "He escaped Riverrun with me," Jaime confirmed. "You go on ahead, brother, I shall attend to him," Kevan said to Tywin as he marched on to greet Cleos joyfully. Jaime and Tywin continued on to the pavilion, a large red tent with the Lannister banner flying above on the spires. Inside, Tywin poured 2 goblets of wine and Jaime told his story, about Lady Catelyn, their escape, his oath to return Sansa, all of it, sparing no detail and draining his cup over the course of the tale. "So, it appears Lady Catelyn has disarmed her own son of an advantage on blind hope. If I did not wish to see her hanging from the walls of the Red Keep, perhaps I'd give her commendations for her aid when the war is won," Tywin said, though the subtext of his words said that he had no intention of giving Sansa Stark back and that all the Starks would be dead soon enough. Jaime would not argue, not at the moment at least, not until Sansa Stark was somewhere Jaime could do something about her. Tywin then told his story, of Robb Stark's incursion into the Westerlands, of Stannis and Renly's battle, of the Ironborn attack on the north. What astounded Jaime was when he was told of Tyrion's appointment as Hand of the King in Tywin's absence. "Tyrion? Our Tyrion? You named him Hand of the King?" Jaime asked, disbelieving in what had happened. "Curious, isn't it?" Tywin asked. "Very much so," Jaime agreed as he laughed. It did not surprise Jaime of Tyrion's effectiveness as Hand, but rather their father actually recognized Tyrion's capabilities to hold the office, something Tywin had been in denial of since, always. "When your brother was taken by Lady Stark as a prisoner, I thought he would be nothing more than a disadvantage, a feckless prisoner in need of rescuing to hinder our war effort. Then, not only did he secure his own freedom from Lady Stark, but also arrived at my camp with an army of savage wildmen from the Vale who he had convinced to join us in battle rather than killing him," Tywin explained. Jaime smirked as he imagined his sliver-tongued brother talking over the barbarians from the Vale. "Then, when I put him on the left flank of our forces at the Battle of the Green Fork, I filled his ranks with sellswords, lightly armed conscripts and Gregor Clegane's forces. My intention was for their ranks to break under the northern offensive and overshoot our center as they chased down routing force and then pincer them. Instead, when the giants and possessed animals attacked our force, it was Tyrion's savages that held out while our lines were routed and his men who felled a giant and pincered our enemies," Tywin explained as he sat down in his chair behind his table where the map of the 7 kingdoms was spread out. "I was forced to lead the reserves into the center and fight the Northmen and this giant. It took the corpse of an armored horse from one of my knights by the legs and began flailing it about like a morning star." The Lord of Casterly Rock waved his arms above his head, gripping an invisible flail to illustrate the image. "The flailed horse struck my war horse, knocking it dead and pinning me under it. A Northman approached me, knocked my sword away and was about to take my head with an axe. Then your brother appeared, took his head from atop his horse and saved my life. Your brother, the drunken whoremonger who has lived to sully my honor. Without him I would not be here," Tywin explained, sipping from his goblet of wine. "It would seem that there is more to Tyrion than what I had previously thought," said Tywin, as though he were sharing his new great discovery with Jaime. Jaime snorted in response. "You don't say," he uttered facetiously into his cup as he sipped. Tywin turned his menacing glare on Jaime. "Watch your tone, boy," he commanded coldly. "Well, really, father, what do you want me to say? You talk of Tyrion's potential, of his skills that you have overlooked and act like you are the first one to see it. What you've just discovered is something the rest of us have all known for years. Me, Uncle Kevan, Aunt Jenna, all of us know Tyrion's true worth. Uncle Tijet and Uncle Jerian saw it too, but you would not listen to any of us. You squandered Tyrion by making him lord of your sewer, and he responded in kind. You treated him like he would be nothing but a nuisance, and he saw fit to exceed your expectation by visiting every brothel and tavern he could find and drinking, gambling and whoring his way through the 7 kingdoms, flaunting our family name. The reason you never saw Tyrion's potential before is because you were too proud to put the future of the family into someone whose only flaw was that he was half my size. In that moment, Jaime felt his heart thump in his chest as he wondered if he was in more danger now than he was back in his cell in Riverrun. But what was said had been said and was long overdue. Tywine sat coldly and glared at his son for a moment, not angry, not remorseful, just vacant in his expression. Tywine then took in a deep breath and looked at his goblet as rolled his wrist, causing the wine to swirl in his cup. "You're right," he said plain and bluntly before drinking from his cup. Jaime sat in his chair for a moment, dumbstruck at what he had just heard. "Beg your pardon?" Jaime asked, wondering if he could get his father to admit it again. "You heard me just fine the first time. If you have any expectations that I shall get on my knees and beg forgiveness and confess my failures as a father, forget them now. If I say the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, then I am wrong, and insisting upon it will not change that. I was wrong about Tyrion, I can't change that, and pretending I was right out of pride will do me no good. What's done is done. Let us be done with it." And with that, the matter was settled, regardless of whether Jaime wanted to continue it or not. Tyrion is holding King's Landing, preparing for a siege by both Baratheon brothers. With Harrenhal taken, we will march to join him and your sister and fend off both Baratheon brothers. Then from the capital, we can formulate a new stratagem to defeat these now 4 rebel kings, Tywine explained. "And you will be the hand of the king?" Jaime asked, leaning back in his chair. "I already am the hand of the king. But yes, your brother will be relieved as my deputy and installed as my advisor, unless I can find another suitable role for his newfound skills." What was the world coming to, Jaime wondered. "Tyrion as your advisor?" Jaime repeated with a smile on his face. "Yes. I have not worn the Hand's badge in many years, and in my experience in the royal court, being ignorant to the motives, agendas and goings of the courtiers is a dangerous vulnerability. Tyrion will be useful in helping me reclimatize to the game." Jaime was not sure what game his father was referring to, perhaps some strange metaphor that would bore him to hear explained, so he did not press for the meaning. "Perhaps now that I am conscious of Tyrion's true value, I can begin to sculpt him, develop his cunning. When I am done with him, you might benefit from taking him on as an advisor," Tywine suggested. "Me? What, pray tell, would a Kingsguard knight need an advisor for?" Jaime asked. "A Kingsguard, nothing. The Lord of Casterly Rock on the other hand." Jaime scoffed, confused by what his father was talking about, but Lord Tywine paid him no heed and continued to speak. "I have benefited greatly from Kevan's continued service to me over the years. I believe that you will benefit even more from Tyrion as your right hand. You were never much of a politician or an administrator despite my best efforts, and perhaps you never will be. But Tyrion has proven he has the foundation to be great at such things. You are a renowned knight, charming, handsome and charismatic, conjoin that with someone astute, cunning and strategic of thought, and you will have a strong pairing for leadership." Aerys and I formed such a did, and the realm prospered greatly from it. Then the dragon grew too concerned with the opinions of sheep and things began to fall apart. Jaime shook his head. "That's all well and good, father, but there is one problem. I am a knight of the Kingsguard and Tyrion is your lawful heir," Jaime declared, standing to his feet. "For how much longer? When we return to King's Landing, will you expect to retain your position by wielding your sword with a hand you can't even sign your name with properly?" Tywine asked. "I'll manage. I'll train with it," Jaime declared. "But it will never be as good. Doesn't matter as long as it's better than everyone else's. Besides, the Kingsguard is sworn for life. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't step down." "New precedents have been established in your absence, my son," Tywine said. "What precedents?" Jaime asked. Tywine breathed in and out through his nose before answering. "Your nephew the king and his mother saw fit to dismiss Sir Barristan Selmy from his post within the Kingsguard. You were named as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard after him, though you were captured and lost your hand in battle before word could reach you, Tywine explained. What madness is this? Jaime wondered to himself. What madness is this? Sir Barristan the Bold, one of the finest knights to ever live, a true Kingsguard knight, the last of Aerys 7 before Jaime, had been stripped of his white cloak. When Jaime was named to the Kingsguard, he was not worthy of it, something he didn't realize until Aerys had sent him back to King's Landing after the ceremony, only naming him to the Kingsguard to spite his father. The six knew it: Drold, Barristan, Arthur, Luwin, Oswell and Jonnet Hor. He could see it in their faces during the ceremony, he could see it in the way they kept glancing at the king anxiously, hoping he'd call it off at the last second. At the final moment, when the white cloak was on Jaime's shoulders and the oath had been spoken, they all closed their eyes and accepted what had happened. Then the six of them closed in around Jaime, and for a moment he thought they were going to beat him up, but then they cheered for him, patted him on the back and ruffled his hair, welcoming him to the Brotherhood. It was just like that. They knew he was unworthy to be a Kingsguard, but it was too late. The oath had been taken, he was one of them for life. Rather than resent and ostracize him, they took it upon themselves to make him worthy, and when they all returned from Harrenhal, each and every one of them helped craft him in their image, use his youth to impart their techniques and wisdom on a fresh mind, and he absorbed everything he could from each of them. Before Harrenhal, Jaime had one little brother, but after it, he had 6 older brothers. Now Jaime, the last of them, the least of them, the one who failed them, remained while Barristan had been dismissed, a disgrace that had only ever befallen oath-breakers who faced death or exile and castration. Who was his replacement? Jaime asked, wondering who could even begin to compare to Barristan the Bold. Sandor Clegane, Tywine explained. Jaime wanted to vomit. They gave Barristan's cloak to Joffrey's brute. Jaime winced. Now Jaime was furious. The Hound was not a Kingsguard, he was anything but, nor were any of the current White Cloaks for that matter. Mandon Moore was deadly and skillful, but a cold and unchivalrous man. Sir Preston Greenfield was a formidable fighter, but not quite up to standards with the Kingsguard, and he did have a mistress in the city that he visited when her husband was away, though Jaime of all people could not fault him for being in love. Prince Luwin also had a mistress during the Mad King's reign, they all knew and they all protected him. Even though it was breaking his oath, it was a monogamous love affair, and the Dornish were a passionate people, and he never let it get in the way of his duties as a Kingsguard. More importantly, no Kingsguard knight would betray Luwin's confidence, for he was their brother and theirs to protect as they were his. Meryn Trant and Boros Blount on the other hand were not slightly lacking in skill and honor, but rather entirely void of it. Jaime had met cutthroats and outlaws with more dignity and skill than the two of them put together. It was Cersea's behest that possessed Robert to name the two knaves as knights of the Kingsguard, for while talentless and dishonorable, they were loyal to her. The only man Robert ever gave a white cloak to who was even slightly worthy of it was Aerys Oakurt, bold, courteous and cordial. He had talent but was still green and a bit too arrogant. Sir Barristan and Jaime had agreed that with time, training and some humbling he'd make a fine Kingsguard knight. Jaime had spoken to Sir Barristan of the two of them mentoring Aerys together, as Aerys 6 had done for Jaime when he started out. More than just molding Aerys as a Kingsguard knight, he had hoped it was a chance to get close to Sir Barristan once again and regain his respect. Sir Barristan said he'd think about it a few weeks before Jon Arryn's passing. Now Sir Barristan, the only true Kingsguard knight amongst them, the only one whose worthiness to wear the white cloak was irreproachable by any, they dared to strip him of his cloak in such a tasteless manner that had never been done before, and to add insult to injury, they gave his cloak, to a dog. More than just a new knighted sworn sword, he was a Clegane of all things. The Hound had nothing to do with the Mountain's actions on that grim day in King's Landing, and the burns on his face showed how void of love the two had, but still, no man who shared blood or name with Gregor Clegane deserved to wear the white cloak. "Was this your doing?" Jaime asked, accusing his father. "Is this some kind of way of punishing me? Finally, getting your revenge because I forsook my claim to the rock and forced you to recognize Tyrion as your heir? You stripped the only true worthy knight of his white cloak and give it to Joffrey's pet to teach me a lesson about loyalty to the family. Is this my lesson, father? Like that act of barbarism you made me complicit in when Tyrion married that poor girl." The mighty Lord Tywine slammed his fist down upon the table, so hard that Jaime fell silent. Tywin's burning eyes of rage stood apart from his otherwise cold and composed face. Tywin then rose from his seat and slowly walked towards Jaime, each step making Jaime more anxious as his father approached. When Tywin came face to face with his son, the burning rage on his face subsided but the anger in his eyes remained steadfast. "A lesser man would strike you for speaking such insolence if he were your father and liege lord," Lord Tywin explained calmly and coldly. "But no matter how much defiance, disappointment and disrespect I have suffered from you, your sister and your brother, I have never once raised a hand to any of you, nor shall I begin to. Let that be your lesson in what kind of a father you have, boy." Jaime clenched his jaw. Tywin gave a stern hrmph and sized up his eldest son. "So that is the truth of it. You think your own father so repugnant and dishonorable that I would desecrate a sacred brotherhood that has stood for almost 300 years all to spite you?" Tywin asked. "You think I have no regard for the Kingsguard? Do you think I have no sense of sanctity beyond my own ambition and pride? Have you forgotten that as a boy I grew up for a time in the Red Keep? As a child you liked to play with your wooden sword and call yourself Duncan the Tall, but I knew the man when he lived and breathed. I knew Gwaine Gaunt and learned techniques from him alongside Aes and Steffon when we trained with our wooden swords. I knew the White Bull and Barristan the Bold as Kingsguard knights long before you ever knew them as brothers." The faces of Jaime's two old comrades haunted him as his father said their names. "You dare to speak to me of unworthy men calling themselves Kingsguard knights? I knew Sir Harlan Grandison, a fine knight, a just man and a skilled warrior. I tried to warn you that Aes only offered you the white cloak to spite me and that it was no matter of your talents as a knight, but you would not listen, you let your pride get the better of you. You forsook your duty to your family, the Westerlands and the realm. Also you, a boy of no more than reasonable talent at the time, could wear a cloak reserved for better men." Jaime bowed his head in submission and shame. "To be clear, I was appalled when I found out that Joffrey had dismissed Sir Barristan from the Kingsguard. I told your brother as much. His naming the Hound as a replacement was even worse. I will see to it that it is rectified and have him dismissed as a Kingsguard when I petition that he remove you." Jaime looked up to his father. "So I am still a Kingsguard then?" Jaime asked. "For now. Though I doubt you will maintain your position once I have explained things to the king," Tywin declared. "We shall see," Jaime thought to himself, grasping a glimmer of hope he could remain in his position. Cersei had more sway over Joffrey than either of them and she would not let him be sent away. Tywin took another deep breath and glanced away and back at Jaime. He then gently rested the tips of his fingers on Jaime's face, seeming to be attempting to show affection. "I was worried about you, son," Tywin said before lowering his hand. "The hour grows late. Go find your lodgings wherever your uncle has put them and wash them up. Meet me here for dinner. We will discuss our return to King's Landing in detail." With that Tywin turned from Jaime and returned to the table and Jaime left the pavilion as instructed. As Jaime walked down the hill from where his father's tent was positioned, he contemplated all that had happened in his absence and found himself partially wishing he'd never left his cell. Chapter 31, In the Sight of Gods and Men. Chapter text. There was a word in the old tongue that came to mind when Robb awoke, and that word was Duis. The best translation for Duis in the common tongue was either fuck or shit depending on the context, a general curse word of varying meanings. When Robb's mind was awake but his eyes were still closed and recalled his dream from the previous night of an improper encounter with Jane, he thought, "Duis, what a woman." When Robb opened his eyes and saw Jane, lying there in his bed, asleep and facing him, he thought, "Duis, what have I done?" Lady Jane was an unwed maiden and Robb had taken her virtue. In the unspoken customs of the culture, a man could spread his seed as he saw fit before or after his martial vows, but for a woman to lay with anyone other than a man she was married to, she would bear it as a mark of dishonor and scandal if word got out. Robb quickly roused Jane and after the initial moment of shock, they hurried to dress and cover up what had transpired. Jane apologized to Robb for acting improperly. Robb assured her she did nothing wrong and apologized to Jane for taking advantage of her friendship and kindness. Robb could not explain how he and Jane ended up abed together, even if he had 100 years of reflection to come up with an answer. It just sort of happened. Balon Greyjoy had sent letters across the Seven Kingdoms, declaring himself king of the Isles and the North and claiming conquest over Robb's homeland. When word reached them, Robb was horrified, angry, frantic and paranoid. He could not say what had happened to Theon. Maybe he was captured, maybe he was killed, or maybe he had betrayed them. How much of the North had Balon Greyjoy conquered? Surely he would not claim such a thing if there was not some validity to his words. How many of Robb's people had died in his absence? And what of Robb's brothers? What of Bran and Rickon? Were they under siege while Robb and the armies of the North were in the Westerlands, sitting on his asses waiting for their king to heal? Robb only began walking on his own 2 feet without a walking stick a few days ago. Meanwhile, the war continued on. Robb was angry, upset, worried, full of self-pity and self-hatred for his blunders, and Jane was there for him. She had become a friend and companion during his time at the crag, and that night when Robb was in his chamber and she came to check his injuries, she consoled him, then they shared a kiss and then they shared the night. As the two of them hastily got dressed, the door swung open and in strode Jane's mother, Lady Sybil, a handsome, older woman in a green and black dress. Jane gasped and covered herself with the sheet of the bed as the lady of the crag looked at the two of them, eyes wide and full of fury. Dois, Robb thought to himself once again. It seemed that a handmaiden had come into Robb's chamber to bring him breakfast while he and Jane slept, and left the chamber to tell Lady Sybil what she had seen before either of them awoke. After that, the news spread through the castle like a forest fire. There was no chance of concealing what had happened now. Lady Sybil and her brother Rolf demanded the king make reparations for sullying their daughter. Jane's elder brother Sir Reynold, who was being held in the dungeons after being captured during the taking of the crag, demanded to be allowed to face Robb in single combat. The most uncomfortable moment was when Robb gathered all his nobles in Crag's Great Hall and addressed them on the matter. All of them were gathered together with somewhat blank expressions as they looked at their king. With his heart beating fast and his stomach twisting into a knot, Robb breathed deep and held his head up high. "My lords, warriors and knights. I come before you humbled and ashamed. As your king, it is my duty to comport myself with maturity and restraint. As many of you have surely heard, last night I failed to act appropriately and gave in to childish recklessness. Especially in this time of war when you need your leader to be focused and dignified, there is no excuse for my transgression. You are owed better from me and I beg forgiveness from all of you." Robb bowed his head to his bannerman but was met with silence from the crowd of his followers. The first to speak was Sir Stephen Free, who cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Your Grace, everyone in this room was once 5 and 10 at one point or another. When most of us were your age we had all been with women outside the martial vow," he declared, followed by coy laughs of agreement from the others. Several one of the Vale Knights added, followed by laughs and cheers. "We've all been with plenty ladies of varying status since this war began," another lord added, nudging the ribs of one of them beside him. "Your Grace. Many men who march off to war seek the comfort of women in their beds. As one so young I am surprised you did not do it sooner," Galbart Glover added. "You have claimed a crown, united your people against our tyrannical enemies and have won a slew of victories for your kingdoms, great feats men twice your age would be lucky to achieve in a lifetime. It will take more than one night of passion to sully your reputation," the great Jon added. "Any man who dares speak ill of you for one small night of passion can suffer a broken jaw from me," Toreg Giantsbane added. Robb felt humbled by the loyalty and understanding he was being shown by his people and not entirely sure he was worthy of it. After thanking his men for their understanding, Robb dismissed them from the hall. When the room was clear, only Jon remained, leaning against the back wall with his arms folded and the Blackfish standing at the side of the hall with his hand resting against the wall and the other resting on his hip. Neither looked happy. When the door closed, leaving the three of them alone in the chamber, Jon stepped forward and began to walk towards Robb. When Jon was standing in front of his half-brother, his glowering expression fixed upon Robb, he began to shake his head. "You're an idiot," Jon declared bluntly. Robb was surprised by Jon's judgment, to say the least. With Jon himself being a bastard sired in an affair during wartime and his relations with Talisa, it seemed surprising that he of all people would hold Robb in contempt for his actions. Robb glanced at the Blackfish, whose expression showed no disagreement with Jon's statement. "I did not intend for it to happen," Robb began, trying to defend himself. "It was an accident." The Blackfish scoffed and shook his head. "What? You just tripped and accidentally got your cock snagged on the girl's maidenhead." Robb pinched his nose and sighed, becoming embarrassed by his great-uncle and brother's scorn. You both heard all those men. I didn't do anything that they didn't do at my age, or still do now. How many women has Walder Frelane with outside the marital bed? Or Tyrion Lannister? Or Robert Baratheon? Not exactly an illustrious list of men, Robb the Blackfish pointed out. And what about you, Jon? How can you judge me? I've seen the way you are with your friend Talisa, and let's not forget that our own father sired you in the same manner, Robb declared. It's not about what you did, it's who you did it to. If you want to seek a woman's companionship, fine, more than half of the men in your army have done so, highborn and commonborn alike. But you didn't spend the night with a serving girl or a merchant's wife or a farmer's daughter or even a whore. Jeyne Westerling is a noble maiden of an honorable house, Jon declared. Robb tensed up as he heard Jon's words. You can gallivant around with as many women as you like and no one will care. But that poor unmarried girl gave her maidenhead and now everyone knows. Worse yet, she gave it to the king in the north, the enemy of her house and the family they serve, the Blackfish added. Do you know why this castle is so poorly maintained despite its size? Why the number of people who work here are so small, the Blackfish asked, looking around the hole they were in. It was true that the crag seemed a ruin from most angles and the garrison and staff of servants was smaller than expected for a castle so big. It's because the Westerlings have fallen on hard times and their wealth has dried up over the years. When Lord Quain married Lady Sybil from the Spicer family, it was out of desperation to receive aid from the Spicers' wealth. That may have saved the house from starvation, but it decimated their reputation. The Spicers started off as merchants, raised to nobility by Lord Tywin's father, and as far as the rest of the Westerlands are concerned, they are practically commoners. Not even landed knights or the lesser branch of the Lannisters are willing to wed into their family, afraid it will taint their blood with the commoner stench. Everything that the Blackfish said was what Robb had already heard from Jeyne herself during one of their long conversations over the time Robb had been at the crag. What do you think will happen to them now? The Westerling girl will be called a whore and a traitor for being with you. Her only hope of salvation will be to take vows as a septa, and the only hope her family have of salvaging their honor is to disown her or accuse you of raping her. You've ruined her life. Who will wed her now? Jon asked. Robb took a deep breath. He had already thought of all these things now lain out before him and had devised a way to mitigate the damage, though he feared it would not be a well-liked plan. There was no sense in hiding any longer, and so he spoke up. Lady Jeyne will not become a septa, Robb declared. Sir Brynden and Jon exchanged looks of confusion. She has to. If she remains in the crag, even as an unmarried maid, her family will never be free of the shame, the Blackfish declared. She will be married, Robb assured them. The confusion on their faces grew and Jon scoffed. To who? Robb looked at his brother with a serious expression. Jon's expression shifted from confusion to grim realization and finished by shaking his head in denial. I will not listen to this, Jon declared sternly in the old tongue. This is my will, brother, more importantly, this is my duty. I must preserve her honor. Jon grunted and turned away from Robb in frustration before returning his gaze to his brother. By taking her away from her home, making her an enemy of her own people and her family? Jon asked, disgusted. By making her my queen. Her family can disown her to preserve their honor with the knowledge that she will be cared for and loved. I will dedicate my life to her happiness and well-being, Robb declared. Jon leaned forward with his hands rested on his knees. What in seven hells are the two of you on about? The Blackfish asked, not versed in the old tongue. He wants to marry the Westerling girl, Jon explained. Sir Brynden looked to Robb, wide-eyed and mortified. She is a good and honorable lady. She will make a fine queen. I am unwed and without a betrothed, and so I shall make her the consort of my 3 kingdoms. She's a Westerlander. Her father is one of Tywin Lannister's bannermen. You think your vassals will take kindly to making the daughter of an adversary their queen to rule over them? Jon asked. She is not her father, and she is certainly not Tywin Lannister. She will not be judged for the actions of the Westerlands at large, not while I rule, and she will build her own reputation as queen, Robb declared. The argument went on for a while after that, until Jon and the Blackfish finally relented. Later Robb summoned the family of the crag to the hall. Rolf and Sybil Spicer, Sir Reynard Westerling and of course Jeyne. Reynard was kept in chains and scowled at Robb from across the hall. Rolf and Sybil looked down on the king with judgment with stern glares, and Jane stood in the corner, her hands held together and eyes of despair looking to the stone floor of the hall. The first thing Rob did was drop to his knee before them and bow his head. He begged forgiveness and spoke words of remorse to the Westerlings. When Rob spoke of reparations, Rolf and Sybil looked intrigued, Reynard seemed unsatisfied, and Jane's expression of despair was left unchanged. It was not until Rob petitioned Reynard to give him leave to wed Jane that shock overcame the faces of all assembled, none more so than Jane. With the lord of the house, Jane's father Gawain, Rob's prisoner at Seaguard, it fell to Reynard as the de facto leader House Westerling to grant Rob permission to wed Jane. When Sir Reynard requested to be allowed to speak with the king alone, he agreed and had the guards reluctantly unshackle him. As Jane left the room, Rob smiled affectionately to her, trying to communicate through his eyes how much he adored her and how desperately he would fight for them to be together. When the room was cleared, Rob stood alone with the young Westerling knight. He seemed to be near Theon's age, with a thick mop of chestnut hair and a bushy moustache, and dressed in a stained linen shirt, breeches and boots, his weapons and armor confiscated during the storming of the crag. An awkward lull lingered between them as Sir Reynard studied his face sternly in silence. After a moment, Rob tried to break the silence by clearing his throat. "I hear you wanted to fight me in single combat," Rob said, shrugging, trying to approach the situation light-heartedly. "To defend the honor of my sister," Sir Reynard said as he folded his arms. Rob looked to the ground, ashamed. He knew that the same justifications he gave to the Blackfish and John would not be received the same by Sir Reynard. Rob and Reynard spoke for a while, with his stern glares of judgment shifting to curiosity as Rob's humble pleas of forgiveness and explanations of his affections for Jane continued. "Your sister is an extraordinary young woman. Kind, smart, a bit witty when she's comfortable enough to be so," Rob explained to the young knight, rendered completely smitten by the young Westerling lady. Sir Reynard thought on Rob's words. "You wish to make her your queen, not a paramour or some kind of concubine?" Sir Reynard asked, scratching his chin. "Of course. Your sister's happiness will be my utmost priority. She will be given honors and regarded by all as the Lady of North, the Riverlands and the Vale." Sir Reynard's eyes drifted down to the ground. "You are far from what I expected, King Rob. The stories of you in the Westerlands speak of a vicious barbarian who can shape change into a wolf and consorts with practitioners of black magic and relict monsters to cheat his way into his victories," Reynard explained. Rob smirked, bemused by the vivid imaginations of how his enemies chose to vilify him. "I can understand why your people follow you so willingly, Your Grace. A leader that inspires and cares is a treasured thing. Meanwhile, others are forced to toil and face danger in service to men they hold in no renown," Sir Reynard explained, glumly. "Something tells me you speak from experience," said Rob, drawing Reynard's eyes back to him. With a deep sullen breath, Reynard began to explain. "My family have fallen into disrepute and squalor in recent years. When our coffers ran dry, we turned to the Lannisters for help, but the insurmountably wealthy Lord Tywine had no coins to waste on the charity of his vassals and yet still insisted on collecting tax from us. When my father married my mother to save his house from starvation, the Lannisters who turned a blind eye to us threw japes at us, polluting our blood with the common born and laughing about us in their cups." Sir Reynard's fists tightened. "When my father tried to have my sister wed to one of Sir Kevan's sons, he rebuffed her, believing the second son of Casterly Rock was too good for her. Yet no matter how many times they turn us away in our hours of need, they call us to their own service like whipped hounds. They take our gold in the form of tax. My father was with Lord Tywine at Castamere and the sack of King's Landing, partaking in Lord Tywine's acts of barbarity because that was what he was bid as a loyal vassal. Now my father is in one of your cells, and while my family is your prisoner, not so much as a lousy ransom demand has been heard from Casterly Rock. So yes, I know a thing or two about begrudgingly following unworthy men," Sir Reynard explained. "And the first time my family is met by one more prosperous than we who deems himself obligated to us and offers us restitution, it is not our liege Lord Tywine, but you, Robb Stark." Robb bowed his head respectfully as Reynard studied the boy king with intrigue. "With your leave, Your Grace, I would return to my cell now and deliberate on your request to wed my sister." Robb agreed and had Sir Reynard returned to his cell to think about what had been discussed. When Sir Reynard next asked to speak to Robb, it was past nightfall and Robb had him brought to his chambers unshackled and left alone with Robb in his chamber. Rob invited him to sit and offered the young knight wine as the king in the north anxiously awaited Sir Reynard's answer. "You have placed me in a precarious position, your grace," he began. "I indeed wish for my sister's honor to be preserved, and the consort's crown of 3 kingdoms is no small consolation, but if I agree and remain a bannerman of Lord Tywine, my own sister will be marked a traitor and my enemy. As a knight, I am sworn to my liege lord, to my people, to my king and to my family. No matter what I will do, I will break one of my oaths," Sir Reynard explained, bringing fear to Rob's stomach as he took a sip of wine. "But, the oath on my honor to serve Lord Tywine is a betrayal in itself, for how can one honor allegiance to he who has none? And how can I serve my people here in the crag when our continued lives here under the Lannister yoke will see us back to poverty within a few decades? This place is falling apart and my people will soon starve, even if we survive this war," Reynard explained, looking around the chamber. "There is no honor in betraying my sister to save my family's name in the eyes of the Westerlands. There is no honor in remaining here in the crag when it will only lead me, my family and my people to doom. There is no honor in serving a wretch like Tywine Lannister, who will doubtlessly see us carry out his dirty work in his heedless quest for wealth and power. So I put forth another option," Sir Reynard declared. "Give me my sword, young wolf. Give me my sword and I will renounce all lands and titles as a bannerman of Tywine Lannister. I will lead my family and my people into your kingdom and pledge obedience to you. I will swear in the sight of gods and men, before the old gods and the new. My people and I will craft a hold fast or man whatever ruin you offer us and serve you in the north, the Riverlands, the Vale or wherever you place us. The respect and kindness you have offered us is more than we have ever received from any other. I beg of you, let us serve you," said Sir Reynard. Rob was rendered humbled and flattered, and as quickly as he could form the words, he responded. "Then I will accept your allegiance. I will find you good lands in my domain and give you every resource I can afford you to assure that your people never go hungry and live in prosperity under my rule. Furthermore, before I leave the crag I will stand in the Godswood and speak solemn vows of matrimony in the sight of gods and men and assure the world that Jane will be my lady wife and queen, and my people will know her as the highest woman in the 3 kingdoms," Rob pledged, and the 2 young men clinked their cups. Chapter 32, It begins. Chapter text. It was near midday when the first warning bell was struck, an omen of the coming battle in Tyrion's ears. Varys' little birds had chirped the coming of the 2 armies of the Baratheon brothers when they first set out northward towards King's Landing. When Renly's host came up the Rose Road along the edge of the Kingswood, Tyrion sent out his 150 Vale Mountain clansmen to harass Renly's flanks and kill his scouts before they returned to King's Landing in the early morning before Renly's arrival. From the day's earliest light, the city was alive, their mercenaries, gold cloaks and the combined garrisons of the Red Keep, Rosby and Stokeworth arming up and taking to the walls, while those of the city folk who wished to flee took their chance before the gates were sealed. No sign of Stannis on land or on the water, though ships had been spotted off the coast from Mass's Hook by one of Varys' spies a few days ago. Tyrion had suspected this battle was coming since early on in his tenure as Hand of the King. He had been preparing for it since the battle at Storm's End, and with each day Renly's host drew nearer, the coming battle got closer and closer. Tyrion knew the battle was a day away when he went to sleep last night, or tried to, as he wrestled with his anxieties and stress as he stared up at the canopy above his bed in the dark. Tyrion knew the battle would begin when he woke up that morning and was already dressed in armor, and yet when the first warning bell struck, nothing was more chilling or more disarming for the stunted Hand of the King. As the bells of warning gonged through King's Landing, signaling that Renly's host was now in view on the horizon, the city erupted into panic and commotion as everyone went to take shelter in their homes. Tyrion was in the small council chamber standing on a stool and pointing to points on a map of the city when the bell rang. Tyrion's fine suit of armor was still back at Casterly Rock far from him, but nor did he wear the mismatched scraps of Lord Lefford's wagons. The craftsmen of King's Landing had done great work to fit Tyrion with a new suit of armor, and a rather stylish one too. Over his red gamison, Tyrion wore a heavy crimson plate cuirass embossed with a golden lion's face over his chest. Hanging from around his neck over the lion's head was his Hand of the King chain with the dangling golden hand over the lion's forehead. To guard his neck he wore a bever. He did not add the extra weight heavy metal pauldrons to weigh him down, and instead wore small round boiled leather shoulder pads lined with studs, small and light yet hard and tough. He also wore riri braces, cutters, vambraces and lobstered gauntlets, tassets hanging from his waist and greaves over his leather boots. Of course armor was good for protection but not for killing, so Tyrion carried with him his trusty battle axe that served him so well at the Green Fork, and hopefully, it would not fail him now. In addition to the small council, the room was also filled with the commanders of the coming battle. Bronn, Shagger and Tymet, Ironhand and the 7 gold cloak captains of the city gates, the mercenary captains and some of their lieutenants, a few knights who commanded either a group of troops or some trebuchets, catapults or scorpions, cousin Lancel among them, and Joffrey, of course, standing at the end of the table. The boy king dressed in black plate armor chased with gold, encrusted with rubies and marked with a stag on his right shoulder and a lion on his left. Beneath it, he wore a hauberk of gilded mail and a red gamison. Clearly, the boy had taken Tyrion's advice about acting more like a Baratheon than a Lannister if only in image, for Tyrion knew that the boy originally had a suit of enameled crimson plate. The boy king also wore a long blood-red cloak and carried his sword, Heart-Eater, in an ornate red leather scabbard with gold fittings. Flanking Joffrey was Sir Meryn and the Hound, the former dressed in fancy white armor and the latter dressed in his beaten soot dark steel with a white cloak fixed to his back and his hound-molded helm gripped at his breast. The other Kingsguard knights were there too, save for Jaime, who was a prisoner of Robb Stark, and Arys Oakurt, who was protecting Myrcella in Dorne. Sir Boros Blount was once among the white cloaks, fat, dumb, unskillful and greedy. When Cersei had Tommen sent to Rosby away from the city to be safe from the riots and the siege, she did so putting him in Sir Boros's care. While Tyrion agreed with Cersei's plan of sending Tommen to Rosby for his safety, he knew better than to trust his beloved nephew's safety with the likes of a fool and a coward like Blount. Tyrion sent Ironhand's gold cloaks to take Tommen into custody, and Boros surrendered Tommen without a fight, proving Tyrion's mistrust true. Now Tommen was safely guarded in Rosby, and Cersei saw fit to make Joffrey strip Boros of his white cloak for his cowardice and just as quickly give it to one of the Kettle Black brothers, Sir Osmond. Osmond was an adequate swordsman with an amiable personality, though a little dull, but not a particularly great warrior, and Tyrion knew the 3 Kettle Black brothers to be nothing more than Cersei's lapdogs. Eileen Payne was there too, brooding in the corner, though Tyrion knew not why, for he was not to take place in the battle and instead guard the women in Maegor's Holdfast. Perhaps Cersei had brought him along as though he were her own personal bodyguard. With the warning bells chiming and the echoes of panic in the streets, Tyrion continued to give commands and lay out their battle stratagem. Renly's siege engines move slowly and he knows we can see him coming, so he will undoubtedly make for the King's Gate, his closest and most direct path, Tyrion declared, pointing on the map. He might split his forces and deploy them at the Lion's Gate too, stretching our forces thin by attacking us from 2 points. During the night when visibility is low, he might also try to take the Gate of the Gods or the Old Gate or some point along the walls with a smaller force of ladders or climbing spikes, which is why we will still need to have gold cloaks regularly patrolling the walls and guarding the gates even when the battle is joined, Tyrion explained. What about the River Gate? It's far closer than the Lion's Gate and lies just beyond the path he'd take to reach the King's Gate. Might King Renly not consider deploying a contingent there? One of the knights asked. Lord Renly, not King. Joffrey corrected angrily. The knight bowed his head submissively to the king. The River Gate, or the Mud Gate as people prefer to call it, stands adjacent to the Blackwater Rush. In order to reach it, Renly will need to move his force down the muddy track of the Fish Market, which will be difficult for his siege engines. Also, our fleet is assembled in the Rush. If Renly tries to reach the Mud Gate, he will be caught between our archers and siege weapons from both the walls and the ships. Furthermore, Renly cannot afford to battle our ships, even if he has a chance of breaking them on the water. Without his own naval force, Renly needs our ships to challenge Stannis when he finally makes his move. If Renly wastes his own munitions and men trying to destroy our ships, he will be doing his brother a favor and will prove he truly learned nothing from Storm's End. And what is our plan for when Stannis attacks? Cousin Lancel asked. That depends entirely on Stannis. If he leads his men to the Iron Gate, we will wait until his men begin deploying on the shore and then send our fleet out to destroy Stannis' ship from behind. If he sails down the Blackwater Rush, we will challenge him there. But that was all Tyrion would say of it. He would not trust the intricacies of his scheme of the wildfire and the Great Chain to the War Council. No doubt Joffrey or one of Cersei's lackeys would commandeer the plan and ruin it through haste and incompetence. With the last details of their assignments finished up by Tyrion, the War Council dispersed and they all went to tend to their assigned duties. Tyrion stepped down from the stool and led those loyal to him out while Joffrey remained behind for a moment speaking words of ignorant courage to his mother who kissed the palm of his hand, and he listened to his sycophantic lords who praised him and claimed to wait for his victory. In the courtyard of the Red Keep, their horses waited for them, and Tyrion was already exhausted from their march through the castle from the small council chamber, Joff even catching up to him before long with Tyrion's heavy armor betraying his pace. When they reached the courtyard, Tyrion mounted his red stallion, helped up by Pod and Tyok, and when he was properly seated on his saddle, they passed up his helm and shield, heavy oak emblazoned with a golden hand on red, surrounded by small golden lions. Sir Meryn Trant held the king's blood bay for Joffrey to mount. The steed dressed in gilded mail and black plate just as Joffrey was, and mounted on the brow of the chafron where a small pair of gilded antlers protruded out. Upon the king's own head, he wore a helm molded in the shape of a snarling gold lion with Joffrey's face visible in its wide-open maw and a pair of stag antlers sticking out from its brow. It was as though Joffrey had taken the designs from Jaime's gilded lion helm, Clegane's open-jawed hound helm and Robert Baratheon's antlered Greedhelm and amalgamated them into one. How fitting, the helm of the father he thought was his, the father that was truly his and the closest thing he had to a real father in some respects, all their helms rolled together into one gilded ridiculous image and mounted on Joffrey's brow. When Tyrion looked closer he could see around the lion's brown alongside the antlers was a golden circlet of kingship with tiny little prongs. To Tyrion, the helm looked heavy and stupid and would surely draw unneeded attention to the boy. Tyrion had no love for the boy, in fact, he despised him, probably more than he despised anyone else. There was a time when he was but a nuisance that Tyrion neither hated nor loved like the wretched mother who spawned the vicious idiot. But as a king, his cruelty and wickedness were so reviled that Tyrion could not help but hate him with a burning disgust. However, he was still Tyrion's blood, Tyrion's nephew twice over as a matter of fact, and he would do all he could to keep the boy from harm, for that was his duty, and Cersei would most likely blame Tyrion and have him killed if Joff died. So for the good of the family, to fend off his sister's irrational wrath and to prevent whatever tears Tommen, Myrcella and Jaime might have it in them to shed for the vicious idiot, Tyrion would do his part to keep Joffrey alive. As Tyrion prepared to make for the wall, he noticed the young lady Sansa standing in the courtyard, shy and worried as she always was. What is the girl doing in the courtyard rather than Maegor's Holdfast? Tyrion wondered. Surely Joffrey does not mean to drag the poor girl to the battlefield with him. Probably fling her at Renly from a catapult most likely. Tyrion steered his horse to the girl and trotted in her direction. Lady Sansa, he called from the saddle, surely my sister has asked you to join the other highborn ladies in Maegor's. She has, my lord, but King Joffrey sent for me to see him off. I mean to visit the September as well, to pray. I won't ask for whom. Tyrion smiled down at the girl, hoping to grant her some comfort. Tyrion glanced around the courtyard, checking if Joffrey, his Kingsguard or any of Cersei's lackeys were in earshot. Tyrion then leaned forward and spoke hushed words. Do you remember the sigils I showed you? He asked. The girl nodded, yes. Do you have your clothing with your family crest on them? Laid out on my bed, she confirmed. Good. If the fighting goes against my family, go to your room with the pool girl and try not to be seen, especially by my sister or Eileen Payne. Something tells me he's not there to fight off Stannis and Renly's armies single-handedly if the city falls, Tyrion cautioned the girl. This day may change all. For you as well as for House Lannister. I ought to have sent you off with Tommen, now that I think on it. Still, you should be safe enough in Maegor's, so long as... Sansa. Joffrey called out in his childish whining voice as though he were summoning a dog. Tyrion vowed to himself for the good of the family and for the love of those of them who cared for Joffrey, he'd protect the boy, but gods be good, let me fail, he begged in his mind as he looked to the almost noon sky. His Grace has need of you, Tyrion Lannister observed. We'll talk again after the battle, if the gods permit. With that, Sansa bowed and walked off through the file of gold-cloaked spearmen to tend to the mad brat of the Iron Throne. Tyrion watched from afar, for he could not ride off to battle without his fearless warrior king to lead him to victory. Joffrey talked to Sansa, or rather at her, and at one point drew his sword Heart-Eater and forced the girl to kiss it. Then Joffrey got mad at something Sansa said and turned his horse away from her and rode off. Now that the king was ready, Joffrey led the force at the Red Keep out the gate with Sir Meryn and Sir Osmond by his side, Mandon Moore, The Hound and Ballon swam behind, the latter replacing Sir Preston Greenfield after he was killed during the riots. Behind the king and his king's guard were two standard bearers carrying Joffrey's coat of arms on their bannered pikes. Next in the column was Tyrion with Bronn and Shagger by his side, followed by Ironhand, Tymet, Sir Lancel, the Gold Cloak captains, the mercenaries and their lieutenants, the knights and all the rest, and behind them was the formation of Gold Cloaks and the Red Keep's men-at-arms marching on foot four abreast behind. The guards saw them off with shouts and cheers. When they came down the Dragon's Way, they heard more cheers, blessings and praises from the small folk, but when they turned left at the Hook, the crowds turned from loving cheers to begging pleas for their king to save them as they drew near the walls. It seemed those in the city who chose to remain abandoned their homes if they lived on the edges of the city and were retreating deeper into King's Landing's center. When they reached the end of the Hook and came down the muddy way, the streets were almost empty, but when they reached the Fishmonger's Square they found crowds of soldiers with armorers and weapon racks and munitions for their siege equipment, and mounted on the river gate were three of their grand trebuchets, the three whores, they were called. When Joffrey came into sight, the soldiers in the square and the men on the walls cheered for their king as he rode down the River Row. It seemed the River Row was now the front line of their defense, with the army commandeering the houses there as storehouses for weapons and supplies, as well as a number of barracks for men to rest as the siege could last days or even months. The Street of Silk was now being used for first aid, where the physicians and apothecaries could work, as well as a place for men to relax and recuperate between their shifts on the walls. The Street of Steel was now a crafting station for repairs and resupply of weapons, armor and munitions. The city had been weaponized against their enemies, but Tyrion doubted it was enough. When they reached the King's Gate, they dismounted their horses and climbed the gatehouse to reach the battlements. When Tyrion stood at the parapets of the King's Gate, he saw clearly that Renly's vanguard army was no longer on the horizon but slowly shuffling towards the city. However, the banners of Renly's followers could still be seen on the horizon, but from the rear of his army. According to reports, Renly's army numbered somewhere around 80,000 men, recruiting heavily on the road to replace those who had abandoned him for Stannis. Countless banners fluttered across the army. Trebuchets both large and small along with catapults were wheeled forward. 6 siege towers spaced out along the width of the army, and battering rams contained in wheeled scaffolding screens with arched roofs. The forward march of Renly's army soon ground to a halt, just beyond the range of King's Landing's siege equipment. Even after the months Tyrion spent expecting this battle, the weeks he'd spent preparing it, the days he'd spent knowing it was coming, even after hearing the ring of the bells and riding all the way down from the Red Keep to the walls, the suspense of the siege's commencement left the imp in fear and dread. "What are they doing? Why are they stopping?" Joffrey asked. "They are preparing. Gauging our defenses and making a final decision," Tyrion explained. Tyrion saw among the front lines of the army in the distance a small cluster of knights in colorful armor that attracted his gaze. They all looked to be wearing cloaks that looked like rainbows, save for one in green armor with something that looked like golden tree branches on his helm. The banner nearby was green and marked with a gold stag, and Tyrion quickly realized that the knight in green was Renly, and it was not tree branches but antlers on his helm, just as it was for Joffrey. If a reprieve for planning was granted, Tyrion would not waste it. "Spread the word down the lines. We start with a barrage of boulders when they come into range. When their army and their towers are in range of our scorpions, then we switch the trebuchets to oil pots and aim for their towers, rams and men. Once the pots break on impact and they are doused with oil, we load the scorpions with flaming shot. I'll be in command of the 4 heralds," Uncle Joffrey declared, sounding proud of himself. The 4 heralds were 4 grand trebuchets built into the King's Gate, the cousins of the 3 whores at the Mud Gate. The men said that the 4 heralds would give Renly a kingly welcome to King's Landing and the 3 whores would give Stannis a lusty one. "Do not fear. I shall ensure that Renly's towers are soaked with oil when they draw close. Better yet, I will see that the pots strike them near their bases, so when the towers are set ablaze, the men higher up in the towers will be trapped by the flames," Joffrey declared with an evil smile. The Hound looked away grimly from his king. What Tyrion said next surprised himself and even Joffrey. Good. As barbaric as it was to set the towers ablaze at their base so that the men standing on the many platforms up the tower would either burn to death or jump to their own demise to escape the flames, it was a sound strategy. If they took out the top platforms of the towers, they might get a little under 20 men, and the rest on the stories below would just disembark and abandon the tower. But take it out from the bottom, the flames would climb and 5 stories of men would be killed with one shot. It was not a good way to go, but Tyrion did not have the luxury of being moral if he wanted to defend the city and needed to kill as many of their enemies with as little cost to them as possible. He'd already made peace with his ruthless plan that he had in place in the Blackwater when Stannis arrived, and it would not be the last hard decision he had to make. The kind and drunken imp had no place on this battlefield, for he was not needed. If the city was going to survive, Tyrion needed to be his father, writ small, cold and cunning. When the war horns and trumpets of Renly's army sounded, the army moved forward again, and the trebuchets and catapults from within his ranks began to unleash. Most fell short of the walls, a few striking beneath the battlements and one flinging over their heads and striking a house behind them. Tyrion took a deep breath and with his loudest roar, he cried, "Fire!" And the battle was underway. Chapter 33, The Siege. Chapter text. The battle was not over with the first advance, nor the second nor the third, nor any after that. It was midday when Renly arrived with his army at King's Landing, seeming to beat his brother to the field, and now in the late afternoon, the battle had shifted to what seemed to be the beginning of a long siege. Their main encampment, where Renly's queen, Margaery, and their reserve troops waited, was far from the battlefield, just barely visible from where Renly was now. Renly had learned from his mistakes at Storm's End, and rather than blindly throw his whole force at the walls of King's Landing, he meant to drain Joff and the imp of their manpower. The area just beyond the range of the Lannisters' trebuchets was now the new encampment of Renly's army, dug in with trenches and fenced with palisades and tents being set up. Those severely wounded were ushered back to the camp where Margaery and the reserves were positioned. There, the majority of Renly's physicians and maesters were, save for a few to treat immediate injuries that could not wait. Renly was in his newly erected command pavilion, conversing with his lords and knights about how to run the siege. As Lord Randall Tarly pointed to areas on the map and proposed additions to Renly's stratagem, the booming thumps of crashing stones could be heard outside as the catapults and trebuchets traded fire, and the distant battle cries of the front lines were muffled by the canvas walls of the pavilion. The city is far too large for us to maintain a perimeter around the entirety of the King's Landing, but with the cavalry we have, we should position scouts in view of the other 6 gates while we focus our main offense on the King's Gate, and if they try to escape, smuggle food or envelope us, we ride them down, Sir Randall suggested. Good, make it so, Renly agreed. And what of the ships in the Blackwater Rush? Almost 60 vessels, though I'll grant you only just under 40 of them are war galleys. The rest seem to have been conscripted from merchant trader ships, Lord Mathis declared. Let them be. They have not sailed down the river to attack us, and any attempt to take them would put us in the line of fire between the city walls and ships. Those ships are meant for Stannis, not us. So long as they stay up the river I will not trouble them, Renly declared. Is that wise? To leave the enemy fleet unblooded? Raymond Connington asked. There was a time that Renly would agree with Connington, but that was when he still thought warfare was a numbers game. The fewer troops your enemies had, the closer you were to winning. Now Renly had developed a greater understanding of tactics after his failure at Storm's End. Losing to a seasoned battle commander like Stannis was one thing, but if it hadn't been for Renly's failure there, he in his hubris might have botched his assault on King's Landing beyond repair and been laughed at as the fool who lost to a bitter spoiled child like Joffrey, which Renly's reputation might never have recovered from. For that at least, Renly owed his brother thanks, and he would do so, though he'd speak the words to his tomb when he was lain to rest beneath the floors of the drum hall at Storm's End. This siege will be fought on 2 fronts, Joffrey in the city and Stannis on the water. The ships may be Joff's, but unless they grow legs and learn to walk on land they'll be of no consequence to our effort to take King's Landing. The only tactical advantage in destroying the ships is for Stannis, not us. Connington nodded in agreement with his king. See these changes to my plans delegated to my captains and troops. Now, if you will excuse me, my lords, I would like to walk amongst the men and see them on the field, Renly explained as he picked up his goblet of wine on the table. Renly's lords and knights bowed to their king as he exited the pavilion, with Loras, Robar, Iman, Parman and Bryce following him out. Upon exiting the tent, the late afternoon sky of pale pink and blue greeted him along with the scent of smoke and death. Not but 5 hours into the siege and the battle had already decimated the landscape of what should be Renly's capital. The tents and pavilions of Renly's camp were positioned behind a wall of palisades that lined the edge of the enemy siege engine's firing range. On the other side of the wall were lines of ditches and mounds along the outside of the wall with sharpened stakes sticking out of them. Beyond was a black muddy network of trenches and man-made mounds that had been freshly dug up and were still growing. Mantlets, wooden stakes, catapults, tray buckets and scorpions set up across the battle-ravaged field. The grassland beneath the walls of King's Landing was torn up and muddy from the several advances from Renly and challenged sorties from Joffrey. Countless arrows and corpses also littered the field as well as a number of craters from siege fire on both sides. Pillars of smoke from flaming shot could be seen both outside and within the city. Renly took a sip from his goblet as he watched arrows and rocks, both plain and flaming, were traded back and forth between Renly's trenches and Joffrey's wall.